Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto betrayed after pain part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Gentle starlight peeked out from underneath the blanket of the velvet night sky. Only the sharp gash of the moon hinted towards the horrors that were lit up by the soft glow. I'm not usually one for poetry or fine writing, but tonight, at the end, it seemed appropriate. Not that there is much else I can do, lying on my back as I look to the sky while awaiting the inevitable. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, and I am about to die. Nearby, Orochimaru is screaming in Sasuke's voice with unholy terror. Perhaps that had something to do with the fact that the Shinigami was in the process of tearing out and sealing his soul. In any case, I could hardly care less, and I returned to my contemplation of the night sky. Why couldn't the moon have been red tonight? That would at least have made for an appropriately ominous setting. Even a full blue moon would have sufficed. The symbolism of hope for the future would be befitting, but no, all we had was a sickle-shaped gash that epitomized the horrors that humans wreak on each other. When I was still a child, I had once asked the old man Hokage if he knew where my parents were. With a somber countenance, he informed me that they were dead. Being a naive child, this did not have the impression on me that it should have, and it only made me more curious as to where they had gone. So, with a sad smile, the old man held my hand and took me to the top of the Hokage monument, where we had a clear view of the stars. He then pointed at the sky and told me that upon death, everyone becomes a star. What star I will become, I wonder. I was rambling, I realized. Usually by this point Kurama would have bitch-slapped me a couple of times and brought me back to focus. But as of half an hour ago, the nine-tailed demon fox had been ripped from my gut and dissipated. Log only knew how long he would take to reform. I certainly would not be alive to witness that. Speaking of being dead, I realized that the screaming had finally abated. That could only mean that Orochimaru's soul, and by extension Sasuke's, had finally been sealed by the Shinigami. The blight upon the elemental nations had finally been burned away. Good riddance, motherfuckers. And it had only taken the death of every registered shinobi in the elemental nations. I included my 23-year-old self in that, because very soon I, too, would be dead. It was at this point that I realized that the very weight of an otherworldly being's gaze was upon me in its entirety. How I had managed to ignore it to the point of distraction was well beyond my comprehension. It had an overwhelming presence that overtook all my senses. I had known the price I would pay when I activated the technique that summoned him, but now that the moment was actually here, I was terrified. Wildly hoping it would distract the Shinigami, I blurted out, "Orochimaru, my mortal enemy, I call you forth for combat." The Shinigami gave no reaction, which meant that all of Orochimaru's fractured consciousness from his curse-seal freaks had been summoned and sealed. On the other hand, this meant that it was time to pay the price of the technique. With my soul. With no ceremony at all, the Shinigami's arm, burning with curse seals, shot forward and sank into my stomach. I've been stabbed before, and while it was no picnic, it paled in comparison to the sheer agony that spread throughout my being. It was cold, far colder than anything I instinctively knew that existed on our planet. It reeked of being from a cold, dark, dank place in the universe where no sun had ever existed or would exist. Infinite cold where the only thing that reigned was the silence of the grave. The burning cold froze my body and my soul, and left no room for anything else. Through the cold I frantically struggled to draw a breath, and then I died. The Shinigami suddenly appeared far more threatening and powerful, and simply more than before. His horns were red, red the color of blood, red the color of life, red the color that all living things had before they sacrificed themselves to him. His eyes were gray, gray the color of the sick, gray the color of the dying as they waited for him to reap their souls. His skin was purple, purple the color of mottling flesh of the prey as they awaited their inevitable death after being rent apart. Every aspect of his appearance signified death, because death was what awaited all living things. I recoiled away from the Shinigami, the god who embodied death. Of course, he still grasped me by my metaphysical stomach, so I couldn't exactly float away. I tried to focus on anything else around me, but all around me was the vast emptiness of the universe. But as I spread my awareness, I realized that the universe was around me. It was alive. Somehow, I was fundamentally connected to the universe, and it was breathtakingly beautiful. From the smallest quarks to the largest galaxies, I could feel and see and comprehend the universe on such a minuscule level that the only feeble comparison I had, Sage Mode, looked like a child's finger painting against a masterpiece. I could understand the nature of the quarks that made up the protons and electrons. I was less than an hour old and was crying. Unknowingly lamenting my dead parents, I could understand why the sky appeared blue. I was 6 years old and nobody would play with me at the park. I could see new colors that did not exist and understood that they were the frequencies beyond the visible spectrum. I was 8 years old, and the old man Hokage was treating me to ramen, and everybody was saluting the old man and giving him respect, and I wanted everybody's respect. I could comprehend the reasons living beings could not regenerate lost organs or limbs. I was 13 and Sasuke had just speared me with his lightning-coated hand while I foolishly just scratched his headband. I could understand all the mathematics and physics I could never grasp. While in the academy I was 16 and I had lost control and hurt Sakura-chan while trying to kill Orochimaru on the Tenchi Bridge. In fact, I could comprehend far more of the physics that existed on my world. Right now I could easily build weapons that could blow chunks out of the planet itself. I had just turned 17 and the Fourth Shinobi War was in full swing, and the weird tree had just sprung up. I just realized there were other beings outside our planet, and they were already there. I had just turned 17 and the Fourth Shinobi War was in full swing, and the weird tree had just sprung up. They were right there, and we were blind to them. And they were trying to tell us I had just turned 17 and the Fourth Shinobi War was in full swing, and the weird tree had just sprung up. They were telling us. I could hear. 44656174668. With a deep, shocking breath, I came back to life. I was absolutely sure I had been dead a moment ago. I had felt myself die, and that was a feeling I was absolutely sure that I could not have been wrong about. I was also sure something monumental had just occurred, but I had missed it, on account of, being dead. Also, I could see a lot of freaky colors that I was pretty sure didn't exist. And I could see inside things. I could suddenly comprehend their nature. I could also see outside the sky and watch things that I was absolutely sure I had no idea existed only moments before. I could watch distant suns and space dust and interstellar events, and they were breathtakingly beautiful. I could instinctively understand how far apart they were, and how they interacted with one another, and how they had come to be. I realized that somehow, I was fundamentally connected to the energies of the universe. And now that I paid attention, there was something else I could hear. That was when I realized that the Shinigami still had his hand in my stomach. With my heightened senses, the Shinigami suddenly appeared far more threatening and powerful, and simply more than before. His horns were red the color of blood, red the color of life, red the color that all living things bled as they sacrificed themselves to him. His eyes were gray the color of the sick, gray the color of the dying as they waited for him to reap their souls. His skin was purple the color of mottling flesh of the prey as they awaited their inevitable death after being rent apart. Every aspect of his appearance signified death, because death was what awaited all living things. I tried to recoil away from the Shinigami, the god who embodied death. But it was pointless. When an otherworldly being decides to get a grip on you, your only choice is to be gripped. Right at the point I decided to do something stupid like yell at the god who embodied death, I suddenly realized that the world around me had gone unnaturally still. In fact, it was not just the world, the entire galaxy was not moving. The spinning of the sun had stopped. The constant increasing of the distance between the galaxies had stopped, and my head was not large enough to compute exactly what was happening, but I knew it was massively significant. For some weird reason, I got the feeling that it had something to do with turning back time. But that was paradoxical, because time travel is impossible. On a very basic level, picture this. While walking, if you retrace one step by walking backwards, does everything around you go back as well? Of course not. Even if you manage to get everyone in any given area to do something backwards for a single second, does that mean that everyone went back in time? No, because the rest of the planet continued to move forwards in time. For time travel to be even remotely plausible, you would have to know where everything from the largest planet to the smallest speck of space dust had been, and force it all to synchronously move backwards along its path. The energy cost alone would be beyond staggering, let alone the computational power to understand how everything had acted during its entire time. From a human being's perspective, it was impossible. And I was freaking connected to universe, so I knew what I was talking about. Of course, the Shinigami was not human. With a horrible wrenching, groaning sound, the planet around me gave a lurch and started rotating the wrong way. The sickle-shaped moon started rising as it traversed the sky in a way that affronted my ninja senses. The sun's light and heat was sucked back into it, and our galaxy started moving infinitesimally closer to the center of the universe instead of always expanding away from it. If not for the increasingly painful screeching, it would actually have been pretty cool. With each passing, regressing, second, the sound became louder and louder till it reverberated throughout my core, and I distantly realized I was not on our planet anymore but in the blank blackness of outer space, and the only reason I was still alive was because the Shinigami, the freaking being who could turn back time on a whim, still had me in a death grip on me, and the screaming became louder and more primal, like the sounds of everything dying, and the universe itself screamed because it was not supposed to turn backwards this way, and I was at the center of it all because the Shinigami was, and I had no idea why he was doing this. Even though I was overwhelmed with the sense of wrongness the universe was vociferously exuding, something on the distant horizon still managed to capture my attention for all the wrong reasons. Initially it was just a dot, but as it grew closer and larger I could occasionally make out features on its spinning surface. It was the Earth. As it grew closer and the screaming got louder, I got increasingly terrified. My body was already in complete agony just from being a witness to the atrocity the universe was undergoing, but I instinctively knew that this would be far, far more painful than anything I had ever dreamed of. I tried to brace myself, but my body was already reverberating and I was hoping against hope that it would not hurt as badly as my senses were telling me it would, but it was getting closer, and it was far bigger than I could possibly comprehend, and the screaming was intensifying, and I started yelling in anticipation of the pain, and it got closer. And then it hit. The pain was singularly the most intensely unbearable sensation I had ever experienced. It was like being buried alive in a molten lava of pain. I could not breathe because pain, I could not move because pain, and I was certain I was screaming, but I could not hear because pain. All I could see was pain. Pain and death. The death of every single organism that had existed during the time that was being reversed was literally on my conscience. From the tiniest bacteria to the largest sperm whale, from the most peaceful death in the sleep to unborn babies being forcibly torn from their mother's womb, from the slowest growing coral to the fastest growing insects, I felt every death, because I was responsible for bringing them back to life. And I did not even know why. Suddenly it was gone. The intensely overwhelming pain was gone, but the screeching of the universe had grown to such an extent that I was surprised that it wasn't tearing the fabric of space-time. I was sure that the human body was not meant to handle this amount of stress. In fact, I was absolutely convinced that I should have died within a second or two of experiencing that pain. If not for the Shinigami, I would have become a drooling vegetable due to my mind breaking from the strain. Of course, if it wasn't for the Shinigami, I would not have experienced that pain in the first place. The unholy screeching was almost a relief once the miasma of pain had ebbed away. As long as it was not me being tortured, the universe could burn for all I cared. My mind could not survive another assault like that. I watched the planet of life and death recede until it was lost behind the sun. But even looking at the light and heat and radiation reconstituting the plasma that made up the sun, I knew exactly where the Earth was behind it. And then it rounded the sun and started coming closer again. I started hyperventilating and panicking, and I even turned to the god who embodied death and started incoherently rambling and begging him to stop the pain. I even offered him my life, my soul, and he just showed me his sharp teeth that were meant to rip, to kill, to devour, to consume. It took me a moment to realize that the Shinigami was smiling. My immortal soul, the only chip I had to bargain with, my very essence was worth less than nothing to the being whose dominion was death, and me offering it to him was amusing. It was almost worse than the pain I had just undergone. The pain hit again. It was worse than the first time, and I was wrong. The pain was worse than knowing that my soul meant nothing. By the fourth time I had begged, pleaded, reasoned, raged, thrown every emotion I could think of at the Shinigami, but all he did was smile mockingly, smile with those sharp teeth that could devour my very essence at me. By the seventh time I broke. I gave up caring. I could no longer process the pain. My puny brain, the so-called best machine in the universe, was not anywhere near enough to process this amount of pain and suffering and death. I no longer cared why the supreme deity of death was doing what he did. It was probably my karma coming back to bite me on the ass. By the ninth time I developed a sick anticipation. I had never ever felt anything so intense in my entire life, and this was a rush unlike any other. The pain was just a side effect. This was far better than any drug I could imagine. 13 times. 13 times the planet of life and pain and death passed through me, and 13 times I felt the very worst that my planet had to offer. I had given up offering my soul because compared to the suffering of every creature that had died, what was my one tiny soul worth? I had offered everything I owned. I prostrated myself to a higher power, and I was deemed inconsequential. Suddenly, halfway during the 13th time, my body was separated from the Shinigami's, and for 1 second, one blissful second that lasted an eternity, I, too, was moving backward through time. My vocal cords, which had long torn from screaming in pain, were healed. The blood I had lost during my jaunt through time was refilled. My injuries were far more severe than that, but at the very least I would not die immediately. The shock of the sudden healing, the sudden stopping of the screaming of the universe, plus my body hitting a wooden surface and me looking up at a familiar ceiling were more than I could handle, and I let myself be knocked into unconsciousness. The intermittent beeping was the first thing I heard. I had a few vague flashes of people standing over and or bent over me, all of whom wore the beige uniform of the Konoha Medic Corps, their hands covered in the green film of medical chakra and in varying states of panic. I think one or two might have asked me a couple of questions, but I must have lost consciousness before I could answer. I could finally identify the beeping as a heart monitor. It took me a while to fully return to consciousness and process where I was. My head ached and my body was stiff, but I was alive. I had survived a trip through time and space, and somehow not been rent apart at the seams. And what was my reward? A hospital bed. It would have been funny, had it not been so hopelessly inadequate. I mean, did they even have a standard procedure for those affected by supernatural events? Not to mention meeting the freaking Shinigami? Of course they do, I imagine Sakura-chan speaking, complete with the scoff and rolling of the eyes. It's called an autopsy. I cracked a smile at that, even though Sakura-chan wasn't physically there to make the joke. Ah, I see you're awake. You gave us quite a scare, you know. I started violently at the unexpected sound, and given the painful protest given by my body, promptly realized that the stiffness my body was experiencing was not just from disuse, but from limbs that were wrapped in casts. After a moment, though, the pain reduced to a dull throb, and I found myself strangely disappointed at the lack of extended pain. Did this mean I was one of those masochists now? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. And despite everything I had been through, despite all the soul-crushing pain and death I had experienced, hearing that wise old familiar voice was a balm to my wounded soul. I opened my mouth to say Hokage-chan like I used to as a kid, but a cough from Cottonmouth quickly put a stop to that. The Sandaime Hokage poured a glass of water and held it out for me to take. I reached across myself with my sole functioning limb, my right hand, and slowly swallowed the life-saving liquid. Not for the first time, I marveled at how refreshing and revitalizing a simple glass of water could be. I always had a flair for the dramatic. My voice came out raspy, making me realize how exhausted I was, even though I had done nothing but lie in a bed for the last How long had I been out anyway? Although I couldn't see it, I could sense the old man's amusement at my light-hearted reply. It was something I could pick up on even as a child, knowing when he was genuinely upset with me and when he was amused by my antics but going through the motions of giving me a dressing down anyway. Well, you certainly livened up our day with your antics. Although I dare say that my ANBU were not pleased with how you appeared in my office on their watch, especially given your condition. I felt my face fall into a grin, but that action caused a sudden stab of pain which cut off my boast about giving ANBU the runaround when still in my preteens. The beeping from the monitor got louder and more animated for a few moments, prompting a doctor to burst into the room and start checking up on me. While running a diagnostic, he simultaneously started attempting to admonish the Hokage on not being informed as soon as his patient woke up. The old man simply ignored him with a well-practiced gesture, prompting me to crack another smile. It was then that I realized that the doctor had asked me a question while I had been caught up in my amusement. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? How did you even get such injuries? In my entire career I've never seen a single case with injuries as extreme as yours, let alone survive, and I served as a field medic in the last war. What a bright ray of sunshine. Really, his bedside manner probably won him awards at doctors' conventions or something. Although, in fairness, I did have 3 limbs in a cast, lungs shredded with broken ribs, internal bleeding in multiple places, liver damage due to poisoning, and a whole host of other injuries that I probably wasn't even aware of. It had been worse, but Kurama had worked overtime to reduce the damage, until he had been ripped from me at least. But now, back in the present, I was in the awkward position of answering a question without bringing up sensitive information. A partial answer would have to suffice. I used the Shinjutsu, suicide technique. He gave me a look that left me in no doubt as to what he thought of my actions. No doubt he had perfected it on a number of patients before I came along. Once again he started muttering to himself as he poked and prodded at various parts of my anatomy. I tuned him out with a practiced ease, my technique having been perfected on Tsunade-bachan herself, and this guy had nothing on her. I looked around and found the Hokage looking at me with a frank assessing gaze, undoubtedly weighing my words and trying to decipher their meaning. Having completed his checkup, the doctor pursed his lips. As far as I can tell, you're healing up nicely, although it's far too quickly for my liking. Do you have a Kekii Genkai or something? Or something, I quipped agreeably. He nodded. That explains it then. Someone with your level of injuries should have been where you are after 8 or 9 months, not 2. He stuttered and trailed off sheepishly. The reason was the Hokage, who without moving a muscle, either in his face or his body, was somehow managing to radiate disapproval. It was quite impressive. It had confused me for a moment, until I realized that I was an unknown quantity to these people. This might have seemed like a concerned Hokage checking up on his injured ninja on the surface, but this was an interrogation. A subtle interrogation, to be sure, But there is a reason that torture is the last resort for gathering information. Information gained from a relaxed target is generally far more reliable than one gained from someone who would say anything to make the pain stop. And during an interrogation, the information is supposed to flow from the prisoner to the jailer, not the other way around. Even letting someone know mundane details such as the date could have significance, which is why the higher-level prisoners are kept underground and in the dark, to mess up their perception of time. Now that I was a little more alert, I made a few observations. The Hokage had not come within arm's reach of me, even when he handed me the water he had made me reach across myself. Not that I could conceivably attack him with 3 limbs out of commission, but he hadn't become the Hokage by taking needless risks. The bed I was on was also one that was used on prisoners. It allowed for the internal circulation of chakra, but it did not allow it to be manipulated outside the body. There were ANBU in 2 corners, and one just outside the open door. There were other subtler clues too, but it was enough for me to pick up on the gist of the message: you are our prisoner. The doctor, trying to mask his unintentional slip and subsequent reddened face, asked, so does it hurt anywhere in particular? I scoffed. I couldn't help it. I should be dead to start with, and then I had been forced through time and space and pain and death. Of course I bloody hurt. Everywhere. I have a particularly nasty headache though. Having 2 simultaneous conversations were enough to ring my bell at the moment. Slayer of Orochimaru/Sasuke, defeater of just about every single S-rank ninja in Edo Tensei mode no less, and speaking a few words was enough to knock me over. The doctor looked inordinately pleased. Why are all doctors so creepily happy when you tell them you hurt? As he extended a hand glowing with the mystical palm technique towards my forehead. I reflexively closed my eyes as he ran the diagnostic and applied a minor treatment. Your brain is still slightly swollen, so I'm not surprised. It should go away in a day or 2, so don't overtax yourself unnecessarily. He made a note on the clipboard and finally started to leave. He paused at the door. No more than 15 minutes please, Hokage-sama, he said, slightly abashed, not quite meeting the Hokage's eyes. Steely gray eyes that were fixed on me, and had no doubt seen me catalog the various clues and subsequently make the realization that I was a prisoner. His unblinking gaze unnerved me the same way it had when I was a child, and I had to physically stop myself from fidgeting. Too bad my mouth didn't get the memo. So sitting in a tower stamping things all day. How's that working out for you? I cringed as the words rang around the room. I actually couldn't remember the last time I had made one of my trademark dumbass comments. It even got the Hokage to blink, and I swear he was fighting back a smile at that. A moment later though, which village sent you? So much for the subtle approach. I thought that he would ease into the blunt questioning, but he was probably trying to catch me off guard again. Too bad I knew how such interrogations usually went. I smirked. Come now, Ji-chan, I'm sure you went through my possessions and found my headband. Why are you wasting your time with questions you already know the answer to? He frowned. Headbands can be stolen off corpses, he said dismissively, leaning forward. Who sent you? How did you appear in my office? His eyes, already steely, were now narrowed. His voice had gone utterly cold. This was the Sandaime Hokage at his most focused, the man who had won 2 wars and led his village to previously unheard levels of prosperity, the flip side of the kindly old grandfather, the professor. Do we have to do this now? Can't we go get ramen instead? My mouth whined. What was wrong with me? Was I trying to piss him off? Why was I acting so giddy? In fact, why was I so giddy? After a few seconds' consideration, the answer came to me. I was back in time. I had paid a terrible price, a price I would rather have not paid, and I was not sure if my soul had survived intact, but I was back in time. I had a second chance. I could keep my precious people from dying. I could stop the madness before it began. A pure feeling of hope suddenly filled me in a burst of adrenaline, and I could only laugh in joy and relief. But only a chuckle or 2 managed to escape me before pain-filled coughs interrupted what would surely have been an epic cacklefest. On the other hand, laughing insanely in front of your interrogator might not be best idea. You know what I just realized, Ji-chan? I asked as I strained my left arm against its cast, slightly basking in the pain that it brought. I'm in the Konoha hospital. Not the ANBU interrogation facility. The bandages wrapping my left arm started turning red. I guess my resemblance to my old man were enough to raise questions. Questions you no doubt want answers to. I reached over with my sole functional limb, my right arm, and touched my index finger to the blood-soaked bandage. Personally, I think that my whisker marks throw it off, not to mention that I have my mother's facial features. But the idiotic villagers only saw my prisoner when they looked at me. I would love to see their faces the day they realized the truth. My grin widened at his look of shock, and I started to draw a seal on the framework of the bed using my blood. As to the question of who I am, the seal I had just drawn used the life force in the blood to power itself and override the seal drawn on the bed. I am exactly who I appear to be. A spinning orb made of the purest blue chakra appeared in my hand, and the Sandaime Hokage's jaw fell hilariously open. A perfect expression to highlight a perfectly executed prank. It took me a few weeks, but by now the Hokage was convinced that I was who I claimed to be. Mostly convinced anyway. I think he was still struggling to wrap his head around the whole time travel business. That and the only thing I had told him was that I had died and woke up back in this time. Technically it was true, but what was I going to do? Tell him that the freaking Shinigami violated the universe for shits and giggles? I had ample opportunity to convince the old man about the veracity of my identity. Being stuck in a hospital bed with busted limbs ensured that. I had not told him much beyond vague hints, but he had realized that there was no way to have a secure debriefing in a public hospital room. It had been about 6 weeks since I had regained consciousness, the last 4 of which I had spent undergoing the peculiar hell known as physical therapy. In my entire life I had barely spent any time convalescing, and now I was being made to pay for it in spades. They made me walk on those stupid parallel bars, made me undergo strength and conditioning exercises and other frustrating crap, all without the use of chakra. They had a point, to be fair. They tried to make sure your muscles and ligaments were in full working condition before they were supplemented with chakra. Every day was twice as frustrating for me compared to other ninjas, knowing that I had usually had a demonic partner who would usually speed up my healing. He had been my partner since within an hour of my birth, and I felt his loss very acutely. Kind of like missing a big, furry, grumpy pet, but you missed him all the same because he was yours to miss. Kurama would have tried to eviscerate me for thinking that, and that made me miss him even more. Today, however, was undoubtedly a good day. Today was the day that I was released from prison air, the hospital. Today was a day of freedom. Today was the day I officially became a Konoha shinobi again. Today was the day I walked through the familiar streets of Konoha and the Hokage Tower again. And today was also the day an old man decided to prank me. I gaped at the scroll in my hand, then at the Hokage, who wasn't even trying to hide a smirk, back at the scroll and back at the old man as I finally found my voice. Have you finally gone senile, Ji-chan? I detected a note of hysteria in my voice, but all things considered, it was probably justified. The Hokage merely let out a chuckle. If it helps, you can consider it an order. My eyes widened even more. So let me get this straight, I said slowly, deliberately. I get thrown back through the ravages of time. I spend 3 months recovering, the last month of which was the cruel and unusual torture known as physical rehab, and when I get finally the sign-off, you want me. I took a deep breath to run a month of D ranks. The last part was said in a significantly higher pitch, one appropriate to dealing with crazy people. This time he actually laughed. Laughed. I sighed, rubbing my forehead in anticipation of the upcoming migraine. The faces never cease to amaze me. He took a puff on his pipe and leaned back on his chair, eyes twinkling with mirth. It's part of standard procedure. All shinobi who suffer debilitating injuries are given D ranks as a way of easing them back into active duty. Not only does this allow the shinobi to get back into fighting shape, it also lets the shinobi get back in touch with the everyday problems of the village. It serves to remind them what they are fighting for. That actually made a lot of sense. So much so that I actually stopped arguing about doing glorified menial labor. Instead, I just looked out the window over the village and the Hokage monument. It was such a comfort. It had been burned away using the black flames of Amaterasu by Sasuke. A few minutes later, I looked back at the Hokage to find him idly twirling a kunai between his fingers. A very distinctive and familiar kunai. I was wondering where that went, I said as I eyed it. He smiled as he saw that I had his full attention, and with a quick flick he got ready to throw it, but right before he could. Flash. To his view, I probably never left my seat. The only difference was that now I was the one idly twirling the Hiraishin kunai by its ring. I also had a grin from ear to ear. I could feel it stretching my face to its limits. By the log, it felt good to smile again. Sarutobi, too, looked impressed. Splendid, he said right before a mischievous smile spread out on his face. With that, you could complete all your D ranks in a flash, he finished with a smirk. My grin disappeared faster than the Hiraishin itself. In a huff, I put the damn kunai back in my pouch before crossing my arms and staring out the window again. His chuckling was not helping matters any. A few moments of silence later, I looked back to once again find him studying me. Once more I resisted the urge to fidget and gave a small sigh. I knew what was coming, and while I would rather not have this discussion at all, it had to be done. He puffed out a small cloud of smoke. I'm sure you would agree with me that if you met with someone who claimed to be from the future, you would be curious about your own fate. From your hints, I find myself hesitant of asking the question, although at my age, my death is probably not the shock you imagine it to be for me. However, I find myself more curious over another topic. He leaned forward and put his elbows on the table while clasping his hands together. What happened to your prisoner? My medical staff initially found traces of his chakra in your system, but not his presence. I frowned at that. Kurama and I were partners, and his loss was one I felt very keenly. At the same time, though, he was not going to like the answer. He was ripped away from my body a short time before my death, I suppose. I paused here, not certain how to bring up the topic of his once prized student before he turned into a genocidal lunatic. Screw it, I thought. I took a deep breath and charged ahead. By Orochimaru. I could not have hit him harder if I was trying to hurt him. He put aside his pipe, lowered his head, and allowed a weary expression to cross his face. His eyes flickered with a multitude of emotions too quickly for me to identify, but the look of regret on his face was clear enough. After a few minutes of introspection, he finally looked up and locked his gaze on mine. How did the experience not kill you? I'm given to understand that separating the Biju from its host usually kills the Jinchuriki. I nodded my head at the unspoken agreement to drop the Orochimaru angle until a more suitable time. Well, there are two factors. Firstly, I am an Uzumaki by birth. Even my mum didn't die immediately when the Kyuubi was extracted from her, and she had just given birth. Secondly, I was in sage mode, so that acted as a buffer against the damage received by my chakra coils. Make no mistake though, I lost a significant amount of my life force, but given the fabled Uzumaki longevity, I doubt I would have to worry. He made a sound of agreement. Ah yes, Kushina-chan was always spirited. It stands to reason that the two of you inherited that from her. My world came to an abrupt, screeching halt. And considering that I actually saw the world come to a complete stop, that was saying something. I made a few strangled sounds before my voice came back to full coherence. Both of us. I have a sibling. Who? The wizened old coot just gave me an infuriatingly calm smile as he lengthily puffed on his pipe. When he was quite sure he had built up enough suspense, he said nonchalantly, "Why, I mean you and Naruto, of course." I blinked. I blinked again. I blinked a third time and then narrowed my eyes at the Hokage. Explain. I simply meant that both you and young Naruto are quite boisterous. Not surprising, considering you both are technically the same person, but you have been forged in the fires of life's trials. I narrowed my eyes in confusion. What do you mean, me and young Naruto? How can there be two of us? Upon seeing his questioningly raised eyebrow, I elaborated further. How do I put this? You know the Edo Tensei technique. His face took on a dark look, but he nodded. Well, then you understand that for it to work, a soul is needed. Every individual has a unique soul. The fact that you're telling me that a younger version of me exists, I trailed off, lost in thought. This was undoubtedly the Shinigami's doing, but the ramifications of this escaped me at the moment. My unique form of existential crises bore further investigation at the very least. The Sandaime Hokage, too, had a grave expression as he contemplated this unexpected development. But then he shrugged. No doubt it has something to do with why you came back in time. He leaned back as I nodded my agreement, and his eyes took on a sudden twinkle. If you prefer, instead of doing the D ranks, you could return to the academy. I'm sure Irika would be pleased to have two of you in his class. I was torn between shuddering and chuckling in amusement. It would be awesome to have a partner in crime to pull off pranks, and just imagining Irika-sensei's reactions to Double Trouble was hilarious. But I'm pretty sure sitting in with a bunch of 10-year-olds would not do much for my development as a shinobi. No thanks, old man. I'll take grocery shopping and dog walking any day. He smiled. It's probably for the best. We wouldn't want you picking fights with other kids your age. Hey! He was still smiling, but it was slowly becoming more forced. He was clearly disturbed by the revelations about Orochimaru, and I wasn't being very forthcoming with other answers either. After some consideration, he finally spoke. Is there anything in the immediate future that I should know about? I shook my head in relief, inordinately happy that we wouldn't be having a potentially awkward conversation just yet. Nothing major involving Konoha until 2 years from now, the next time we host the Chunin exams. We can start laying the groundwork for a few other moves until then. He nodded with a troubled look on his face. Very well. Continue your recuperation, and report to me in a few days. But before you leave, he handed me a page with a stamped ninja registration ID and a filled-in name. I took one look at the name and chuckled. Nanisher, no name? Seriously? Sensei of the mighty author to the best-selling Ika Ika series, and you couldn't come up with a better name? He snorted, whether in amusement or annoyance I couldn't tell. I read a bit further. Working in the capital for the last decade? Don't the 12 shinobi guardians do that? Your job was to hide and monitor their activities, guarding the guards, so to speak. I've mentioned that it was you who first uncovered the planned revolt by Kazuma a few years ago. He took on a satisfied puff. It should pass a cursory examination. Fill in the rest of the details and hand me the completed report. I will make sure that they get filed appropriately, giving you an adequate cover story. As for your resemblance to your late father, use this." He then tossed me a piece of cloth. I caught it and frowned, not recognizing it initially. It had a weird shape, almost like I grinned. This would be perfect. The resemblance to my first Jonin sensei would just be the icing on the cake needed. Don't be surprised if I turn up late and said I got lost on the road of life. I smiled as I tied on the face mask. He chuckled, "Off with you. Get back in fighting shape as soon as possible. We'll have our discussion then." I nodded and bowed in farewell. "Hokage-sama." "Nanisher." He returned the farewell. The name felt weird, like a piece of clothing that didn't quite fit right. I would get used to it, I supposed, as I left the office. Masks itch. I made this discovery a few scant hours after having worn one. I had no idea how Kakashi-sensei managed to wear one all day and all night. The worst part was the chafing of my day-old beard against the stupid cloth. I absently started rubbing my chin, chafing my day-old growth further, and yet weirdly liking the sensation despite finding it irritating. Ugh. Stupid time travel, messing up my relationship with pain. The mask was very much needed though. Already a few people in the street had done a double take when they saw me, so strong was my resemblance to my father, even though my hair was far longer, and in a ponytail. Having completed my D rank for the day, I looked at the address of the apartment building I had been assigned by the Hokage and frowned. The address seemed familiar for some reason. A suspicion came over me as I started walking towards it. Soon, I realized my feet were guiding me there without me needing any directions whatsoever. A few moments later, I stopped in front of the building, rubbed that stupid mask again and sighed. Goddamn manipulative old coot. It was my old apartment building, the one I had lived in as a kid. Not only that, I was even on the same floor. I had no doubt it was a disingenuous move designed to make me befriend my younger self. I sighed again and made my way up the stairwell, feeling strangely apprehensive about running into him. Thankfully though, my luck held, and I reached my apartment without running into anyone, and I entered quickly. Maybe I would meet him tomorrow. 30 days later. Well, I was officially a coward. I still hadn't met Naruto. I kind of went out of my way to avoid him, coming in during hours when I knew he wouldn't be in and around the building, and sneaking in through the window whenever he was. I could hear him during the evenings, trying to study, unnecessarily loudly in my opinion, his academy lessons. Some of what he said was so horribly wrong made me cringe, but it's not like I was any better at that age, har har. And unless I went over and helped him out, it was likely to stay that way. Well, that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. On the other hand, I had completed my mandatory D-rank mission rotation yesterday, so today was the day I handed in my fake history and officially made my recommendations about the course of action we should take. I was kind of apprehensive, but excited at the same time. I had come up with a few ideas about what to do so as to be ready for Akatsuki and Orochimaru, and I couldn't wait to get started to stick it to those bastards. Over the last month, I had spent 3 or 4 nights every week in his office debriefing him about the events that were to follow. Surprisingly, once these minor sessions were over, I stuck around and just talked to him, and it was fun. He had a surprisingly sharp sense of humor, and I got the feeling that he enjoyed our evenings together just as much, if not more than I did. Upon reflection, however, I realized that he was simply lonely. I wasn't the only one to have lost my family the night I was born. He had lost his wife as well, along with the man who he had entrusted his mantle and legacy to. He had then been forced to shoulder the burden of the entire village, with nobody there to help lighten his load. No wonder he had killed himself in defense of his village against Orochimaru. He probably just wanted to be remembered as a hero the same way the Yondaime was. There was some buzz as I entered the Hokage Tower, and a few people looked curiously at me. It was rare for the old man to block off an entire day just for a simple debriefing, not to mention it was with the guy who literally popped into existence. I made my way up to the office, taking note of their glances but not outwardly reacting. I made my way up, and smiled at the secretary as she let me in, and my smile froze as I once again felt the attention of the hidden ANBU snap onto me. They had not taken kindly to me, what with me appearing right in front of the Hokage. If it had been an assassination attempt it would have been successful, and that was a black mark against them, considering that it was their primary duty. Not to mention, even though the Hokage had added me into the registry I was still unknown to them. I'm sure they must have done their digging and found nobody who knew me, which was because nobody knew me. They kept their guards up around me and that in turn made me tense, but that feeling disappeared as soon as I performed my privacy Fuinjutsu ninjutsu hybrid technique. I am glad to see that you do your Uzumaki heritage justice. Both your parents would have been very proud of your proficiency in the art. Even at your young age you have certainly surpassed me, Sarutobi praised. Being complimented by the man renowned as the professor was high praise, indeed. I blushed as my hand automatically came up to rub the back of my head. It was one tic that I had never managed to rid myself of. Thankfully, I had managed to get rid of my verbal tic a couple of years ago. You still have no idea what I'm capable of, Ji-chan, I boasted. Sarutobi smiled. If I'm right about the tattoos on your arms, you appear to have surpassed your father in terms of techniques. You could say that, I murmured agreeably. I still had trouble accepting praise, but even I knew, now, that there was a time and a place for that. Also, when had I become such a teacher's pet? I look forward to seeing you in action. He put his elbows on the desk and clasped his hands together as he leaned forward. Speaking of action, make your recommendations about the course you wish to take. Well, to start off, I want to be drafted into the ANBU. My presence is the greatest weapon we have against the enemy. While I am getting sick of the staring from the villagers, as an ANBU I would officially have anonymity and report only to you. It would also give me freedom of movement, and some of these plans require me to move out of the country. A few hours later. I still think that had Sasuke and Orochimaru shown up that day and fought on our side against the Jubi and Madara that we would have won. Instead, he summoned all 4 Hokages and I was pitted in a death match against my own father. And I got to know why you were so feared in the shinobi world. And basically everything went to shit from there. But what happened to the Jubi? I snorted. Obito threw a hissy fit. He used his Sharingan to send it to a different dimension. The effort killed him, but apparently he was not feeling very charitable after being betrayed by his boss. I scoffed. Why are all the Uchihas so easily manipulated anyway? Is it something in their blood? Or maybe their own eyes cast some weird genjutsu on them. Every Uchiha I know of is prone to some form of mental instability. The Hokage frowned, but by that point, shouldn't the war have been over? I mean, there was Edo Tensei Madara, but I would like to think that 4 Edo Tensei Hokages would be a match for him. I'm sure Orochimaru would not have appreciated the competition. I shook my head, that wasn't it. Sasuke and Orochimaru took out the cantankerous geezer. The problem was that their team assassinated the daimyos. His expression soured further. I see. Yeah. Once the royal families were killed, the rest of the nobility tried to make a power grab. Killing, betrayal, hoarding of money and resources. At that point everyone just started looking out for themselves. The hidden villages can't survive without the gold and resources coming in from the capital countries, you know this. Once that stopped, everyone either abandoned their village or tried to rule their own country. Orochimaru, meanwhile, either killed every ninja he came across or kidnapped them to experiment on. Say what you will about the man, he said he wanted to know every technique in existence, and by the time he was done, he pretty much did. The only reason I managed to win against him was that I created a new technique with the Shinigami contract. I stretched and cracked my back. I had been sitting in the office so long my ass had fallen asleep. It was a very weird sensation. By then, though, shinobi were persona non grata. They were killed wherever they were identified. The samurai from Tetsu no Kuni were the de facto peacekeepers. They were really good at countering ninja techniques by then. The only one they hadn't managed to kill was Orochimaru. He kept 107 bodies infected with the cursed seal. I know, I counted. I let a grim smile cross my face. Over the years I had come up with quite a few imaginative ways to kill the fucker. It was nice being able to use all of those, and a few from my friends as well. How did you survive the purges then? Liberal use of Haration, mostly. Slowly, though, everyone in our group was either killed or they left and pretended to be civilians. We just wanted the fighting to be over. But it was never over, not for us. The last 2 years before I died I wasn't even in the elemental nations. I spent a year north of the mountains and another year south of the seas, and I learned a lot from those lands. It was their teachings that finally led me to making the technique that took out Orochimaru. I called it Shinigami no Mai, Dance of the Death God. Why did it take you so long to make? Well, my group and I had managed to kill him on a couple of occasions, but all he did was pop up in another body from yet another hidden base. So I needed to make a technique that would force him to fight me over and over. The only way to do that is to get the help of someone to whom mortal hiding places mean nothing, hence the Shinigami. Even then, it's quite tricky to pull off. For it to work, it needs both parties to declare the other as their mortal enemy. Words have power, and naming someone your mortal enemy has a power of its own. Once the verbal contract is agreed, the Shinigami can be summoned at any time by either party, and he can force the enemy to fight. Running is pointless, he can reach across time and space if needed, and force the confrontation. It took me a good month to find and prepare a suitable place to fight. Even then it took a lot of luck to pull off. His eyes gleamed. I see. So it was the Shinigami who was responsible for your time travel. My mouth went dry, my hands clenched, and I started to sweat. Raw terror seeped through my being as I recalled the terrifying journey through space and time. It took me a few moments to try to calm myself. And when I failed, I realized something horrifying. You're not supposed to know that. He took note of my trembling limbs and said slowly, "Do not worry. I'm not going to tell anyone." "You don't understand," I interrupted him, feeling the fear and the horror, and I knew that somewhere the Shinigami was smiling his horrible smile full of sharp teeth, teeth that were meant to rip, to kill, to devour, to consume. I violently shuddered as I shook off the image of the god who embodied death. "You're not supposed to know. That is not knowledge that mortals are supposed to have. And now he knows you know." My voice had steadily risen in pitch and volume, and I was hyperventilating, or pretty damn close to it. "You don't know what he can do." "He can." The universe stopped. For a single second, everything stopped. It had happened right before the time travel, and realizing that sent me into a full-blown panic. My body tensed in anticipation of the pain, the horrifying world-ending pain to come, and I was ready to plead away my soul to the Shinigami even though he would ignore me. And then, to my infinite relief, everything started up again. As far as warnings went, this one was pretty final. I took great deep shuddering breaths as I felt my entire body fill with perspiration. After a few minutes of wiping myself off and gathering myself, I turned to the wide-eyed Hokage. "Do not speak his name ever again. Do not as much as think of him, and maybe he will forget. PFF. Not bloody likely, but I wasn't going to tell the old man that. And most importantly, never, ever, attempt the Shiki Fuin, or any other technique related to him." The Sandaime Hokage, the man once known as Kami no Shinobi, nodded in sincere agreement, his countenance filled with fear. After a few minutes of silence, during which I looked out the window over the village and the Hokage meticulously filled and lit his pipe, he cleared his throat. "Now that you are medically cleared for full training, how long will it take for you to get back to your best fighting shape?" I smiled sadly. "Without Kurama I would never truly be back to my best. Another couple of months, I think." "Why?" He nodded. Good, good. That sounds like you will be ready in time." He handed me a large-sized scroll. I opened it to reveal a bunch of names arranged in the form of brackets. "Is this a tournament?" I asked, receiving an affirmative nod in return. I studied it further, finding my name in the mixing group too. There were a few names I recognized, but what's the catch? "This tournament is not for Chunin. A few Tokubetsu Jonin will be allowed if their specializations lie in combat, but it is a Jonin tournament only." I looked at the brackets ponderingly. But why have the tournament in the first place? Does first prize get a signed copy of Ika Ika or something? He snorted in amusement. "No, they get a week-long vacation out to the hot springs village. Although, you're thinking about entering now, aren't you?" I deadpanned. "Pervy old man." He coughed delicately. "Of course not. Don't be absurd," he said, looking righteously affronted. I just kept staring at him. "This tournament is designed to keep some of our more colorful shinobi from going stir-crazy." I rolled my eyes at the very obvious change in subject, but went along with it. "So basically every shinobi then," I said pointedly. Just as pointedly, the old man appeared to ignore my insinuation about him being as weird as the rest. "All Jonin in the village at the time take part in the tournament, yes. This includes ANBU." I perked up, interested. ANBU members were badass as a rule. If they were taking part in the tournament, it was sure be a high-level competition. But at the same time, I don't remember any such tournaments from when I was younger. Are they open to the public? Of course not. Why would we broadcast the strengths and weaknesses? No, this is a secret tournament. The only ones who know about it are the ones who will take part in it. Appropriate for a village that deals in secrets, don't you agree? I nodded. What if someone who isn't invited finds out about it? His smile turned feral. Why, they get to take part. Against Jonin. Who don't hold back. I winced. No doubt some poor hapless genin had found out about it the hard way. I took a final look at the sheet and handed it back. Fine, I'll be ready in time for them. Good. He took a final puff on his pipe as it went out, and as he cleaned it he asked me casually, "Would you like to join me for a drink?" I blinked in surprise. This was a first. We had spent quite a few evenings together, but this was the first time he had offered to share a drink together. Sure. The moment we entered the bar, every single eye turned to us. The silence was not quite pin drop, but then in a room full of ninjas it didn't have to be. The old man, looking as unruffled as he did during his rounds in the tower, calmly walked past the moderately crowded stools to a corner table that just happened to be empty. After a moment I started to follow him sedately, having had to physically stop myself from scampering after him like I did as a child. I had had a momentary flashback whenever he took me out as a child. The reaction would be exactly the same: silence, followed by uncomfortable scrutiny. I was unpleasantly reminded about the darker side of my home village, and I can't say that I liked it. As I settled down in the chair across from the Hokage, I resisted the urge to squirm under the collective gaze of the bar patrons. That was when I realized something else. Our coming here tonight was no coincidence. You're not going to induct me in ANBU. He shook his head. I have already been down that road. A few years ago, a shinobi who had lost the last few people he cared about in a single night approached me and asked to be placed in ANBU. I granted his wish, and for the first few years he had an impeccable record. No missions failed, no comrades lost. He was the perfect shinobi. Then he started slipping, taking unnecessary risks, making poor calls. It is only by luck that he never managed to fail. By then, he had realized that by not dealing with his issues he was prevented from reaching his full potential. It took him longer to realize than I hoped, but he got there in the end. He tendered his resignation from the ANBU, and I took it with no small amount of relief. He leaned forward again, clasping his hands in his signature style. How good a teacher would you say Kakashi was? I frowned. Having known Kakashi for a long time, I could not refute any of the Hokage's statements. Kakashi was a good guy who had lost his way for a while. Maybe if he had been on his game he could have smacked some sense into Sasuke before he betrayed us, but yes, Kakashi had not been done any favors by his stint in the ANBU. And Sarutobi was a good enough leader to keep track of his mistakes and not repeat them. I had been counting on the anonymity that ANBU would have given me to carry out my plans. This would make it harder. That didn't mean it wasn't the right decision, though. As our drinks were delivered and poured, I raised my saucer in a toast to meddlesome old coots. To disrespectful young brats 100 years too early to challenge their elders, he shot back. I smiled at that as we drank. As we placed our saucers down, another thought struck me. You had already planned this. That was why you placed me in that tournament. He nodded his assent. Yes. You have lost everyone you cared about, and been through traumatic experiences. You would benefit from spending time in the village and getting to know other people your own age. They may not be your old comrades, but if you give them a chance, I am certain you would not find a finer group of people. I paused as I considered that. On the surface, it sounded callous, replacing your precious people with other, cheaper models. But such is life, I supposed as I took another sip from my saucer. You lose people along the way, whether they are grandparents, parents, friends, or lovers, but you don't stop living your life. And part of that is finding other people to care about. As I looked back up, I found the old man studying his own drink intently. If there was one man alive who knew what it was like to lose people, it was the Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure. Good evening, Hokage-sama. A voice suddenly interrupted our separate musings from over my shoulder. I didn't exactly tense up, but I was extremely wary. I tried to use my peripheral vision with limited success. All I could see was the standard Konoha Jonin uniform, same as I wore. I could have created a Kage Bunshin, but this wasn't exactly a hostile environment, which meant that this was a test of my reactions by the unknown ninja behind me. Shinobi greetings. Go figure. Ah, Genmakuen. How are you this evening? The Hokage replied with his usual genial grandfatherly smile, allowing me to put a face and a name to the shinobi behind me. Allow me to introduce the latest addition to our shinobi forces. This young man is Nanisher. As he came around the table, I noticed that he was missing his trademark saban between his teeth, but his bandana was on the same as always. Shiraniginma, he introduced himself with a short bow. I inclined my head in greeting, but stayed silent. I could play games too. He chuckled. The man with no name, no face, and no voice. How very mysterious, he said with an easy smile. He had always been an easygoing character. Perhaps I just let my skill speak for itself. Oh? Was that a challenge? His eyes glinted as his smile grew wider. A man of action, someone after my own heart. And do you often give your heart away to men moments after meeting them? I shot at him with a smile of my own. He laughed at that. As tempting as some of the fine specimens of Konoha's male population are, my heart, I fear. His voice dropped an octave as he gave an appreciative glance to a passing waitress. Belongs to the ladies. The waitress, feeling eyes on her, turned, only to be met by Genma's gaze, which had snapped up just in time, and a roguish half-smile. She turned back away, giving nothing away, but there was definitely a slight extra sway to her hips that wasn't there before. I let out a snort of amusement as she walked away. He turned back to look at me. Perhaps I will take up your challenge. Would you like to spar sometime? Sure. I just got cleared for heavy-duty training, so it might be a little while. No problem. Let me know whenever you feel up to it. He turned to the Hokage and gave a full bow. Hokage-sama. He received a nod in return and departed. Well, what a nice coincidence. You wanted me to meet some people in the village, and someone just happens to go out of his way to be nice the same day. How very convenient. I might have been laying the sarcasm on thick, but the manipulative old coot deserved it. I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about, he said as he delicately sipped from his saucer. He set it down as I let out a derisive snort. I got the feeling that you knew him. I did. Once he found out my parentage, he was the one who started teaching me the flashiest technique I know. I see. He poured another saucer of the sake, poured it down his throat in a shot, and set his saucer down with a sense of finality. I should get going. What, no more people for me to meet? No more friends dropping by? How about a blind date? Why not even an arranged marriage while you're at it? He smiled at my antics. As a leader, it is important for me to stay away from places where my subordinates come to unwind. Tonight I made an exception, but it must remain a rule. But you should stay. Unwind for a while. I dare say you've earned it. There was no doubting that. I nodded and I rose along with him, and as he put on his hat I bowed in farewell. Some of the curiosity went out of the room as the Hokage left, but people were still giving me looks, sizing me up. Thinking about what the old man said though, he was right. I had earned it. I quickly poured myself a shot. Tonight I let myself unwind. Tomorrow I started heavy training. 24 hours later. Sage mode wasn't working. Naturally, this was troubling news. At the end of a gruesome training session today I sat down to meditate and feel the natural energy around me. As it turned out, I could feel the energy, sense it, but it flowed through me like water. It refused to enter my chakra coils. I was frowning as I walked back into the village proper, letting my feet carry me. Well, maybe it was because I had not signed the Toad summoning contract yet. After all, most ninjas are pretty much motionless when they fall asleep, and they didn't wake up to find themselves turned into stone. Or wake up at all, whatever. Yup, once I signed the summoning contract I would be a sage again. Although why that thought failed to fill me with comfort I did not know. Still, it wasn't all bad though. I mused as I still garnered curious looks from the populace. Idly I wondered what their reactions would be like if I started to walking around wearing my dad's old trench coat. They would lose their shit. That alone made it a prank worth pulling. Nostalgia overcame me as I recalled some of the best pranks I had pulled as a kid, and one glorious week in particular when I went all out on a rampage. There was that ugly merchant who was inordinately proud of his mustache, which I had shaved off after finding him drunk one night, that one rude academy instructor who mysteriously couldn't find any underwear one morning and was forced to go commando and sat down in something wet. And there was this one really mean fat cat that belonged to this equally mean old lady, so I found some itching powder and put it on him while he was asleep in the sun. And then there had been another villager who had hissed at me rather rudely, so I had found an ordinary garden snake and put it in his room at night. And there was this other merchant who told me to get my ugly orange clothes out of his sight. Can you believe it? He called orange ugly. So I dropped a bucket of orange paint on him when he entered his shop. He was so mad, you should have seen the look on his face. I had actually put my hand on the flap to enter the Jiraiya ramen stand. When had I decided to come here? Before I realized that the sounds were not just inside my head. I froze for a second, before slowly pushing the flap and letting my eyes widen at what I knew I would see. Naruto and Irika. A very young Naruto, sweet log had I really been that scrawny, and a very carefree, albeit increasingly horrified-looking Irika, but there was no mistaking the duo. My brain stopped, my heart stopped, even my breathing stopped for an eternal second before my mouth decided that this would be a great time to say something really stupid. Sensei. 5 minutes earlier, Ichiraku ramen stand, Yumino Irika. Yumino Irika was exasperated. No, scratch that, he wished he was simply exasperated. He was so far beyond the end of his rope that he couldn't climb out of this stupid well that he had dug himself into. And it was all the fault of one Uzumaki Naruto. Of course, the little blonde pranking terror was simply doing what he had always done best, irritate people into acknowledging him. The Hokage had come by on a couple of occasions before during the academy recess, and he had come earlier that day as well, to speak to the instructors regarding Naruto. All he asked them to do was give Naruto some attention and be there so that he could talk to them. And as usual, all the instructors had listened respectfully to their venerable leader while he spoke, before ignoring his words and letting their bigotry cloud their opinion of the young child. Not that Irika hadn't been guilty of the exact same thing in the not-too-distant past. While it was true he had initially hated the blonde, thinking him to be the demon fox. He had a funny feeling that each time the Hokage had come to their lounge that he was speaking to Irika specifically regarding the blonde. Just out of curiosity, he had tried to see the blonde kid from a neutral standpoint, and he had been rather surprised and shocked at what he found. Uzumaki Naruto was a normal child. Albeit one who was starved of affection, or any kind of attention for that matter. But a normal child he was, and doing childish things to try and gain attention. Playing the fool got him more attention from his classmates than playing the studious child did, so he played the fool gladly. And slowly, but surely, Irika saw more and more of himself in the young blonde, and before he knew it, he had taken Naruto out for a ramen dinner just so he could understand the blonde better. The first dinner was understandably awkward. Naruto kept shooting him mistrustful glances, but he seemed to open up to him by the end of the second dinner. And now, it seemed that the kid just couldn't stop talking. How he managed to keep jabbering while practically inhaling ramen was a mystery. And it seemed he had been in a rather grouchy mood recently. He had all but declared war on whichever poor soul would try to pick on him, and Irika had taken him out to try and understand what his issue was. It was then that he made the fatal mistake of asking what all pranks he had pulled, instead of why. His jaw dropped lower and lower, and his eyes spread wider and wider with every syllable that came out of Naruto's mouth. Some of the pranks he had pulled made him feel vaguely horrified, and he had been on the verge of stopping the kid for the sake of his own sanity when a voice suddenly said "Sensei." The voice itself sounded as if it belonged to someone who was his own age, but he found his head automatically turning to the newcomer, just as it did for a student who wanted to ask him a question. And he was surprised at what he saw. The first thing that struck him about the stranger was his bright blue eyes, eyes he could have sworn he had seen before. The mask and the ponytail gave him, in Irika's opinion, a frankly ridiculous look. He wore a standard Konoha Jonin uniform. The only personalized item that he was wearing seemed to be a pair of orange fingerless gloves. But what was really weird was that the stranger had called him sensei, when clearly he was too old to have been taught by Irika. But that didn't stop him from looking at Irika with a multitude of emotions, the most prominent one being shock. It was as if he had expected Irika to not be alive at all. Irika had no idea how close that was to the truth. But that emotion was nothing compared to what crossed his eyes when they were laid on his young student. Automatically his hand dropped subtly to his kunai holster in case the man was thinking of attacking his young charge. That gesture alone spoke of how far his relationship with the Jinchuriki had come along, but it seemed there was no need for it. A weird feeling of nostalgia and regret seemed to roll off him for a long moment, before Irika finally replied to his curious statement, "May I help you?" He snapped his eyes away from the child. "My apologies, I thought I knew you." He then seated himself at the opposite end of the stand. The melancholic feeling was still in the air, but it was clear that hurting Naruto was not on the stranger's mind. Irika watched the man order 2 bowls of Ichiraku's finest, wondering what was so familiar about him, but had no idea that he had been completely tuning out Naruto until the prankster pulled on his sleeve to get his attention. Irika-sensei, do you know that guy?" Naruto asked in his normal, bratty loud voice. "What? No, of course not." Irika tried to rebuff his student, hoping he would get the message. "Then why were you staring at him?" the young knucklehead asked with no tact whatsoever. "No, I wasn't!" Irika exclaimed vehemently, but it was in vain as the blonde stranger started chuckling. "He's not as dumb as he looks, is he, Yumino-san?" the man said, looking over at them with a slight crinkle in his eyes along with a small movement of his ears that suggested he was smiling. "Hey kid, you like pulling pranks, right? Well, did you know that your sensei over there was quite a notorious prankster when he was your age as well?" "Wawayo, what? Irika-sensei, you pulled pranks. What all did you do? Please teach me, sensei." Irika's entire thought process at the moment consisted of oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. The poor man spent the next 5 minutes trying to calm the hyperactive Naruto down, a task in itself during normal circumstances, made all the more difficult now that Naruto knew about Irika's similar past, telling him no, it's not true, and you shouldn't do it either. When he finally looked up from a silent but fuming, on a child that was just pouting, Naruto, he realized that the melancholy stranger had already finished his ramen and left. Who was that? 9 weeks later. There are times, in the village hidden in the leaves, when the atmosphere becomes lighter, when the whispered excitement brightens the mood, when the knowing glances raise the sense of occasion. These times usually occur once every 2.5 years, when the finals of the Chunin exams roll around. Everyone, from elite Jonin and even the Hokage, to the greenest of greenhorn genin and civilians, understand the shifting atmosphere and look forward to it. It is, after all, a time of festivities and betting, and there is a carnival atmosphere that even the visiting dignitaries enjoy. What the majority of the village population never realized is, such occasions take place far more often in their own village. During the reign of the Shodaime Hokage, before any of the shinobi world wars had broken out, there was an unprecedented era of peace. Most of the villages were still being formed, and quite a few of the rivaling clans had joined the same village, so there were very few hostilities in between villages. But they had all been born shinobi, and shinobi needed to fight to keep their skills sharp. Daily practice only did so much, and to prevent the majority from going stir-crazy, the Shodaime instituted what would later become the Jonin tournament. Of course, the early edition was far removed from the underground affair it was today. When it was first conceived, it was mostly a shinobi free-for-all battle that was open to the public. In fact, clients were invited to view these battles as a way to show off the strength of the village's shinobi. For people of that time, such open display of their techniques went against everything they had been taught while being raised in their respective clans. Secrecy was paramount, because a single hidden technique might prove to be the difference between life and death. But the formation of a village was unprecedented, and so they all readily embraced this change. Needless to say, the same tradition was carried on in what became the finals of the Chunin exams. And so did the other part of the free-for-all. The Chunin exam fights were of course open to the public. But the Jonin tournament was not. The reason for this was very simple. After all, why would the village broadcast their strongest techniques and their strongest shinobi? That was just asking for trouble these days. Any rival village could easily infiltrate them and devise counters for those techniques. Hence they decided to have the fights underground, a few at a time, so that daily missions were not compromised. The reason for having the tournament itself had remained the same from when it was first conceived. They needed to have a measurable target setter for their shinobi so that they all knew where they were lacking. After all, nothing drives your weaknesses home like having your face smashed in with them. And so, every year, the Jonin tournaments are held in a seemingly abandoned part of the shinobi town. There are 3 decrepit and derelict-looking buildings and nothing else around for almost a square kilometer, and there is a fairly strong genjutsu around the place that makes the hair rise on top of the head of whatever unfortunate soul goes nearby. If one ignores the initial feeling, it gets stronger and stronger the closer one goes to the building. The beauty of this genjutsu is that it attacks through the audio canal, so that even if you dispel it once, it immediately takes hold again. If one makes it to the front of the building on sheer guts alone, they start hyperventilating and a terrifying feeling takes hold in the pit of their stomach, and they are known to start hallucinating and screaming before running off entirely. How else does one protect their ANBU headquarters after all? The Jonin tournament itself is held in the main building of the ANBU. It is open to all shinobi of Tokubetsu Jonin rank and above. This includes unmasked ANBU and full-fledged Jonins too, of course. The fights are refereed by ANBU captains and the higher-ranked Jonins, and as they like to say, their word was law. It was from the first building that I exited, blinking at the sudden glare of the sunlight. After the minimum lighting in the ANBU facility, where the only route that was lit up was the way in / out to the fighting arena, probably to keep the secrets of the Black Ops barracks, secret, even the softer luminosity of evening enough to hurt my eyelids. Nearby a hidden ANBU agent ran a disruption technique over me to prevent the genjutsu from taking hold, but he or she needn't have bothered. Genjutsu were not a problem for me, as my last opponent, one Marino Ibiki, had found out to his detriment. I had been assigned the Tokubetsu Jonin rank by the Sandaime, to start with. He said he would revisit that decision at the end of the tournament. But it did mean that I would start out at the very bottom of the chain, and would have to go through 2 preliminary rounds. Full Jonin went directly into the draw, and a handful privileged few who had been granted the elite Jonin rank were given the option of being wildcard entries. While on the surface this may appear to be favoritism toward the upper-ranked shinobi, it was actually a way of coaxing them into the tournament. The whole point of the tournament was to raise the quality of the individual shinobi, and the best way to do that was by teaching them new techniques and tactics, and the best way for that was to ensure that the best shinobi took part in the tournament. Unfortunately, certain highly ranked shinobi found the whole idea of a tournament to be rather troublesome, and would rather pursue other activities, such as reading porn, watching clouds, eating anything and everything in sight, for example. Hence the special privileges, only they didn't really work. I had to say I was disappointed by the competition as a whole so far. I suppose it was because it was peacetime. While people were in fighting shape, they weren't at their very best. They lacked that edge, that gleam in their eye that came with the knowledge and the confidence of knowing they were fighting for their lives and they were going to win. Or maybe I had been fighting a war for too long. My first opponent had been a recent recruit to the NBU, and she had relied mostly on her tanto with some taijutsu thrown in. While she had been no slouch, I dispatched her speedily, daily training with Lee for over a year and a half, allowing me to pick apart her style with ease. After I won my second fight, I hung around and watched some of the other fights, some of which were disappointingly straightforward. I was beginning to realize why it was only the later fights that drew most of the attention. Still, gathering intel on possible future opponents was hardly going to be a complete waste of time. But a hard day of work deserved a reward, which is why I was heading to Ichiraku's for a bowl of ambrosia. I smiled as I recalled the first time I had gone to the ramen stand since my trip back in time. It had been right after the old man had given me that stupid mask and the dumb name, which still took me a second to react to. Tucci had been as welcoming as ever, giving me a free bowl as this was the first time, to his knowledge, that I had eaten there. The simple harmony between him and I as they worked was a joy to watch, and it brought a true smile to my face. To protect the small and simple happiness in life, this was why I would fight. As I ate my ramen, I pondered on my training. It had taken me nearly a month before I could say I was in any kind of fighting shape. My chakra reserves were now a quarter of what they had been, and they were not refilling anywhere near as fast as they used to. I would have to change my entire fighting style, and that was going to be a bitch. It made me miss the grumpy old fox again, and it wasn't just for the added benefits. I couldn't believe what I was about to say, but it was true. Not being a Jinchuriki sucked. Of course, if I had been given a choice as a child of being a hated figure among the village populace for something beyond my control, I would obviously have chosen not to be one. But having gone through the systematic isolation from the villagers, and being ignored for the most part by my tenant, when I finally made the breakthrough it had been a thing of beauty. I had won over the villagers and even the nine-tailed demon fox, the lord of the demons. I was on the cusp of attaining peace with the elemental nations, about to fulfill the prophecy that both the toads and the fox believed in. And then Sasuke ruined it all. There was no way I was going to let that little fucker just walk around. If it was up to me, I would have gouged out his eyes and replaced them with his balls. On an unrelated note, in my own time, that was the method used to kill the body of one Uchiha Sasuke. But the old man had asked for a little time before deciding what to do with the deranged psychopath, and I was not going to be patient for very long. I would revisit the conversation once this tournament was over. Speaking of the tournament, I had a day off tomorrow. I estimated that I was at about 2/3 of my new fighting capacity. I was still getting used to my new recovery rates. Still, I would need to step it up a notch during training tomorrow, because I had realized that this tournament was more or less a formal ranking test of my abilities. Why did I know this for sure? My next opponent was Hatake Kakashi. 2 days later. I was nervous as I waited in the arena. This would be the first time I saw Kakashi-sensei since he had been killed that fateful day of the war. I had no idea how to react to him. He had been killed defending me from my father's Hiraishin. I wish it was one of the cases where I never had the chance to thank him for everything he had done for me. Unfortunately, Orochimaru had other ideas. Within a week I was fighting an undead Kakashi, emotionally trying to say goodbye to him while he tried his hardest to kill me through his tears. It was a sick strategy, but an effective one. What better way to demoralize troops than forcing them to fight their own comrades? My musings were cut short by the sudden arrival of Kakashi, who was surprisingly on time. I could not stop the feeling of regret that rose in my chest as I looked at him. In return, though, I only found cold, calculating eyes that were busy cataloging everything about my appearance and trying to understand my fighting style from that. I forced myself out of my funk. This was not the time or place for distractions. I had avoided people from my past so far, but living in the village as I was, that was not going to be a long-term option. And what better place to start than the present? As soon as I steeled myself, I saw that Kakashi push up his headband, proving that he was not taking me lightly. As soon as I caught sight of the red that made up the Sharingan, my body unconsciously fell into the stances that were designed to throw off that damned eye. The Sharingan was a powerful tool, but it had its weaknesses. The best two ways to negate its advantages were either attack with enough speed that the user could not keep up, or mix up your taijutsu style. Tense one arm but attack with the other, make to jump but make an entirely different movement. As was the case with most of my discoveries, I had found this entirely by accident. Lee and I had spent the next year and a half training to come up with the perfect taijutsu counter to the Sharingan. Lee was the next person who I was forced to fight in Edo Tensei mode. During my musing, the proctor started the match and Kakashi made to take advantage of my distraction. As he made to attack me with a sweeping fist, I tensed my arm as if to block and my back leg as if to absorb the blow. Then I struck out with the aforementioned leg and nailed him in the solar plexus. A clean hit, the perfect counterattack. I knew Kakashi well enough to catch the widening of his eyes in shock. And if the muttering in the gallery around the fighting area was any indication, they were shocked as well. I smiled. There was something else I had added to my repertoire over the years. It was time to use it. Surprised? I think you'll find you need something a lot stronger than a little pink eye to impress me. Trash talking. It was surprisingly effective, not to mention it came naturally to me. It was probably something to do with my nature as a prankster, knowing what buttons to push on people to get them riled up. Insulting Obito's final gift to Kakashi was probably a good way to get under his skin. And if the way his eyes narrowed at that was any indication, I had succeeding with both my first strikes, physical and oral. He chose not to respond, however, and made to move when he suddenly stopped. That might have had something to do with the kunai that had suddenly appeared at his jugular, however. My perfectly created, sealless and smokeless, Kage Bunshin continued the dialogue. What, no snappy comeback? The man who copied 1,000 jutsu couldn't copy a few cliched villainous lines? Irk. The clone gurgled as it was viciously dispelled courtesy of a kunai to the throat. Good job with the timing creating the clone. It was in the same moment when you struck me in the chest, right? I nodded, impressed at his deduction, and he continued, You can't seem to control them very well though. Oh? Are you sure he didn't do exactly what I wanted him to do? His eyes narrowed, then widened as the sound of a sizzling exploding tag on his vest reached his ears. With impressive speed he managed to shimmy out of his vest and hurled it at me while jumping in the opposite direction. I had been expecting this and used a simple kawarimi, substitution, to get out the way, whereas Kakashi was attacked by a few clones using taijutsu. He was expecting them this time, however, and made short work of them. So you can deal with exploding tags and Kage Bunshin. Impressive. I'm sure you will be a big hit at the next Chunin exams. Yeah, he was definitely pissed now. Mission accomplished. Although what was the point of that again? He quickly formed hand seals and called out, Right done, Raikyu, lightning release, lightning ball. The amount of chakra pushed into the technique as well as the speed it was shooting towards me was an indication of how pissed he was. Now, we couldn't have that, could we? In response, I reared my fist back, gathering wind chakra around it as I did so. A moment later I let my fist fly forward, calling out, Kaziken, wind fist. A fist formed of wind chakra followed the trajectory my hand would have taken had it not been attached to my body, and it met the right end technique in midair. Both techniques fizzled out. Kakashi's eyes narrowed as he saw both techniques disappear. He knew that I had intended that to be the result. Futon beats right on after all. So far I had kept him on the back foot by goading him into attacking first, and counterattacking where he least expected it. I would let him try one more technique before taking the initiative. Having trained under him, and recalling the bell test perfectly, I knew that having already used taijutsu and ninjutsu, next he would use genjutsu. I was right. I felt the buildup of chakra before he forced it around his Sharingan eye, causing it to spin ominously. I felt the genjutsu settle down on my senses, before the seal that I grafted on my Simon, the gate of life, above my spinal cord disrupted it. Kakashi wasn't to know that, however, and he immediately made a Kage Bunshin of his own and they moved in tandem to attack me with kunai. As soon as they got within striking range I released the wind chakra I had gathered in each arm in the form of futon, Yuha Sho, wind release, beast wave palm. The clone was destroyed, but to Kakashi's credit he spun to avoid taking damage and landed a kick on my upper arm. I backpedaled to avoid taking more damage, but having been on the front foot for the first time in the match Kakashi pressed his advantage. Hastily dodging his kunai swipes I managed to draw in my breath, futon, tappa, wind release, breakthrough. He leapt away to avoid being hit by the bullet of wind, but it had served its purpose. I couldn't engage him in a long taijutsu battle. My tricks to negate the Sharingan's advantage only worked as long as the user relied on the dojutsu to fight. Knowing Kakashi, he would not make the same mistake twice, and in a taijutsu battle I would most likely lose out, which is why I needed to put some distance between us. Since taijutsu was out, and not being a proficient user of genjutsu, that just left ninjutsu and weapons and my secret weapon for me to continue. I started with the first two as I began the process of corralling Kakashi into a specific point on the arena floor. Futon, Shinkajioku, wind release, vacuum spheres. I called out as I shot several wind bullets in a pattern that looked random but would force Kakashi to move in the direction I wanted him to go, but he proved that he was an A-rank ninja as he called out, Katan, Hozenka no Jutsu, fire release, Phoenix Sage fire technique. Like my attack earlier, his fire perfectly burned each one of my wind bullets, with no leftovers, most likely making a point. So he was not above petty showmanship either, good to know. I could use this to my advantage. Suddenly switching tactics, I shot towards him with a kunai in hand and a vague half-formed plan in my mind. Relishing the change of pace, he too shot towards me, flicking a kunai and dispelling the clone I had created in his blind spot without as much as moving his eyes. We locked in a fierce battle of the limbs, either of us holding back our punches. Block and counter-block, our limbs moved quickly through the minimal distance between us as we both sought an advantage in the physical battle. I took a few more hits than he did, but by now I was dodging in a way that made sure he was being maneuvered. Like before, once more I drew in my breath and shot out a futon, tappa, wind release, breakthrough. Like before, Kakashi leapt away and landed exactly where I hoped he would, He had chosen a different direction to dodge than before, but I knew him well enough from my youth to accurately guess what he would do, and my decision was vindicated. Unlike before, this time I locked eyes with his Sharingan as I molded my chakra, which once more started spinning ominously. For the first time in the match, I started forming hand seals a tad slower than I normally would, hoping against hope. Come on, take the bait. Yes, I thought as he immediately started copying my hand seals, appearing to move a fraction faster than I did. He tried locking me in a genjutsu again, but it was pointless. The seal on my Simon saw to that. I couldn't help the vicious grin on my face as I slammed both palms on the ground and watched Kakashi copy my actions: Fuinjutsu, Chikaka Banpain, Sealing Technique, Earthen Vampire Seal. I called out. Raw shock showed on Kakashi's face as he frantically looked around for the 3 characteristic seals surrounding him. Had he jumped away immediately, he might have stood a chance, but now it was too late. By his expression I could tell he knew his chakra was being drained faster than you could say kunai. Confusion warred across his eyes, and I decided to tell him how I had beaten him. Burrowing clones, I called out, and he locked eyes with me. I couldn't read the expression in them, but I couldn't help myself from taunting him like I had throughout the match. I raised a hand and mockingly waved at him. Night-night, copycat. Kakashi passed out, his body having been drained of chakra, and the proctor called out Shosha, Nanashur. Thunderous applause burst out from the viewing gallery as I looked up and realized that the number of attendees was far higher than I had originally estimated. My hand went up to rub the back of my head sheepishly as I fought the urge to wildly celebrate. I caught the eye of the Hokage and he nodded, silently congratulating me on my victory. I gave a grin and a slight bow as I made my way from the arena, content at having kicked my former sensei's ass. As far as I was concerned, he had deserved it. As I left the building, I mentally started ticking off. I had tonkatsu ramen yesterday, so today I'll have miso ramen. 2 days later, Jonin Tournament Finals, viewing gallery. Hatake Kakashi was a man who was well known for being tardy. He was also well known for a lot of other things, such as being a damn good ninja, flauntingly reading the Ika Ika series in public, but it was the laziness which was his hallmark. Nobody ever expected him to be on time, because he was a good 3 hours late every single time. It was quite a common joke among the shinobi populace that Kakashi would literally be late for his own funeral. It was therefore quite a surprise when Kakashi entered the ANBU headquarters a good 15 minutes before the final fight started. Kakashi lazily swept his eye over the gathering, trying to ignore the amused stares and muttering. There were even a few pointing fingers at him. He moved to a corner near the balcony overlooking the fighting area, hoping that the idle chatter surrounding the perennial latecomer would die down. After another minute or so, however, he actually heard someone mutter, "Do you think he's turned over a new leaf?" Now that just won't do, Kakashi thought to himself. To discourage that very hope before it took root, he did the other thing that he was infamous for. He pulled out a volume of the finest literature written by the finest shinobi Konoha had to offer, the brightly orange-covered book Ika Ika. And just like that, within a few seconds everyone went back to whatever they were doing before he entered. Me? On time? That would be the day. Kakashi's lips twitched under his mask as he started reading, studiously ignoring the fact he actually was on time. A perverted giggle escaped him soon after. "Oh-ho, Aiko-chan, you naughty girl." He felt someone walk up to him, and just as the other man was about to speak, Kakashi beat him to the punch without turning his head. "Ah, Ibiki-san. You're here to watch as well?" Ibiki only let a minor flash of irritation show across his face. He had known Kakashi too well for too long to be disgruntled by how the man always seemed to know who was behind him, even though he had just one uncovered eye. Of course. Given who he's fighting, I wasn't about to miss the show. "Is that the only reason? No sadistic pleasure stemming from the fact that he beat you?" Kakashi replied without missing a beat, his voice completely toneless, belying the fact that he was trying to get a rise out of the interrogator. Ibiki, however, merely raised an eyebrow. "Didn't he beat you as well? In the last round?" Kakashi simply turned the page of his novel. "He caught me by surprise," he admitted evenly. Ibiki's other eyebrow rose. Catching a man like Kakashi off guard was not something that happened frequently. In fact, he could count the number of times it had happened in the last 5 years on a single hand. The man was an A-rank, borderline S-rank shinobi for a damn good reason. Kakashi himself had shrugged off the loss. He didn't enjoy losing, no shinobi did, but at least he had completed the mission he had been assigned. /*flashback, Hokage's office, 10 days ago */ Kakashi had not been expecting this when the Hokage had asked him to his office. In fact, when Sarutobi had performed the privacy seals with a grave businesslike expression, he had been pretty sure he was being assigned an S-rank mission. This was not something he would ever have expected to be asked. After pondering it for a few moments, he spoke. I refuse. Those fights are pointless for me, he said in his usual lazy drawl. He contemplated taking out his book. This was not something he had a problem taking a stand on. Sarutobi, having expected this exact reaction, merely pushed a piece of paper towards him. In spite of his apparent disinterest, Kakashi picked it up. It was a long diagram of the contestants in the tournament and their matchups, right up to the finals. Kakashi noted, with some mild annoyance, that the Hokage had already placed his name in one of the blocks. Direct your attention towards contestant number 66, Sarutobi said, taking out his pipe and his tobacco pouch. Kakashi pondered the name and followed the probable path of the contestant, taking note of the likely opponents he would face. After a couple of minutes, he raised his eyes to the Hokage, who was by now puffing away on his pipe, but looking straight at Kakashi. So who is he? An ANB you want tested? Kakashi asked, his casual voice belying his piqued interest. A long-term sleeper agent I decided to reactivate. He's only just returned to the village. I want to see what he's capable of. And you most certainly will if he gets through even half of these people, Kakashi thought to himself. It does unbalance the rest of the tournament, of course, he said blandly. Sarutobi puffed on his pipe. I would consider it a favor if you entered the tournament. The old man ignored his statement entirely, his eyes still trained on the elite jonin, where they had been ever since he had walked in the door. Kakashi's interest was now well and truly stoked. He realized that the old man could just as easily have ordered him to enter the tournament. In fact, it was an order, albeit coated in the veneer of a favor. It gave that much more gravity to the request. Kakashi let his eyes drop down to the sheet in his hands once more. Do you really believe that he would make it as far as the semifinals? Kakashi asked, sidestepping the Hokage's request for the moment. The semifinals would be where they would meet, if they both won their respective blocks. It was quite a valid question, as Kakashi knew nearly all the people that the unknown entrant would be facing, and none of them were pushovers. For the first time since the meeting had started, the Hokage smiled. Of course, I would not be making this request of you otherwise. He claims to be at Jonin level, but I need more proof than his mere word. Kakashi raised his eyes, having made up his mind. Very well. The smile the Hokage gave him should have been a warning about what was to follow. **flashback and **. Kakashi had a sneaking suspicion that the Hokage knew that he would be beaten. Of course, there was no way to prove it, but he couldn't help but feel as if he had been played somehow. But in any case, it didn't matter now. At least he had obtained a favor from the Hokage out of the whole deal. That counted for something. He hadn't even realized he was not paying any attention to his book whatsoever. His lone eye was wandering, noting the quite large number of attendees for the event. Of course, having not attended for the last few years, he had no idea what the sample size for such an event was these days. But it seemed a fair bet to say that nearly all the off-duty shinobi were here for the fight, even the NBU. They were all broken into groups, and from the few scattered conversations he was able to pick up, it seemed that almost none of them knew who the masked stranger was, or what all his capabilities were. Therefore, it was quite natural that almost all the people who had fought him over the course of the tournament were at the center of most of these groups. Kakashi idly wondered why he wasn't, before realizing that between his orange book and Ibiki's intimidating presence, very few shinobi would have the nerve to actually walk up to them. And if he wasn't mistaken, one of those few was walking up to them that very moment. The rather distinctive smell of lingering cigarette smoke made it very easy to identify him. Asuma, Kakashi said in his usual drawl, his eye having dropped back to his literature. Ibiki nodded to the newcomer as well, who merely hummed in greeting. They all stood in amiable silence for a few moments, before it was surprisingly broken by Kakashi. So, have you heard of him? It was quite obvious, even to the newly arrived Asuma, who Kakashi was talking about. Ibiki shook his head. No, and that is troubling, he spoke in his dry gravelly work voice that unconsciously put everyone's guard up. The perfect voice for his chosen profession, Kakashi idly thought. An unknown powerful shinobi with no known background set off all the red flags in Ibiki's book. His work dovetailed with intelligence after all, and this guy was a prime candidate for causing trouble. I heard Hokage-sama is keeping an eye on him personally. Asuma's distinctive throaty voice made itself known. Didn't the two of you fight him? Ibiki nodded, before looking at Kakashi, who shrugged. Kakashi had gotten over the fact that he had lost, but still felt a small stab of embarrassment, which he ruthlessly crushed. He knew that they were not trying to get a rise out of him, but trying to get more information. His taijutsu is quite good, but not nearly as good as his ninjutsu. He seems to have mastered futon manipulation. Surprisingly, though, he seems to specialize in fuinjutsu. He didn't use any genjutsu at all. Ibiki nodded. He seems immune to genjutsu as well. I hit him with some of my more powerful contact illusions, and he shrugged them off like flies. Kakashi actually let his book down and stared with a wide eye at Ibiki at that little nugget. The Marino clan was not a numerous one, but that wasn't to say that they were weak. They were famous for their niche genjutsu, ones that required actual physical contact. Once someone was caught in it, they could not escape by the normal genjutsu dispelling techniques, but until the instigator of the technique performed the required hand seals, they were stuck. The kicker was, the illusions were more suited to interrogation situations, but worked just as well on the field. Most shinobi would not think twice before engaging the enemy in taijutsu, and a single touch was enough to leave them screaming in imagined torture. Of course, in the field that left them wide open and very dead. Kakashi processed this for a moment, reaching a conclusion, then spoke in his slow drawl. My Sharingan genjutsu had no effect on him either. Ibiki returned the flabbergasted look Kakashi had given him moments earlier. He shrugged again and continued, given his specialization, I'm inclined to suspect that Fuinjutsu is involved somehow. Asuma once more hummed before speaking. Well, looks like your techniques are useless then, Ibiki. Ibiki's eyes narrowed and the shadows moved to make his face look more terrifying than it was. He didn't like being told that his techniques were pointless. In his line of work, that got people killed. Asuma continued, looking towards Kakashi, a small reason for that being Ibiki still had his scary interrogator face on. But I was surprised to hear you lost rather quickly. You're one of the top jonin around. Kakashi's book was nowhere in sight at this point. The unknown shinobi was now someone who he officially was interested in. He was ready for me and my techniques. He's not someone to be underestimated, that's for sure. What I am interested in is how he deals with this challenge. Ibiki let out a terrifying smile. She hasn't been let out for any missions for a while. She's been itching to cut loose. Kakashi looked at Ibiki with an amused smile. A nice guy like Marino Ibiki feeling bitter over a single loss? Log be damned. Down in the arena. When the semi-final rounds were announced, most people in Konoha, those in the know, would have expected the final round to be Hatake Kakashi versus Mato Guy. Instead, they would be treated to the spectacle of a literally nameless shinobi against Mitarashi Anko. I had foregone visiting the other semi-final, assuming that I would be facing Guy in the final, and had prepared accordingly. I had been astonished to hear that Guy had lost. The grapevine said that he later claimed it was due to unyouthful tactics. Having had a vivid personal encounter with the scary snake lady during my Chunin exams was enough to let me guess what those tactics entailed. I mentally tallied up what I knew about the woman. Tokubetsu Jonin in rank, former apprentice of Orochimaru, hence a snake summoner and probably a ninjutsu specialist, had a boisterous personality, liked to use mind games to mess with people's heads, skilled in torture, interrogation and intelligence gathering. So overall, a less violent but probably more insane version of Orochimaru. Considering that I had beaten Orochimaru silly, I should have this in the bag. She may have been the apprentice of the snake Sannin, but in my own way I could be considered the apprentice of all three of the Sannin. As I noticed that the Hokage had taken his place, there was a sudden explosion of smoke in the middle of the floor. A few fireworks shot out through the smoke and formed the letters winner, Mitarashi Anko. As they continued to crackle, I could vaguely recall Kakashi-sensei berating me for doing the exact same thing on a mission, saying that the only thing that made me good for was target practice. I seriously considered attacking just to piss her off, but one look at the exasperated proctor was enough to put me off. He would probably disqualify me just for pissing him off even further before the match started. As the smoke cleared, I got my first look at the self-proclaimed sexy and single Mitarashi Anko. Her violet hair was done up in a short, spiky, fan ponytail. She had her trademark beige trench coat on along with a full-body mesh suit. A short, orange skirt and a pair of shin guards completed her appearance. Her hand was rubbing her head in a manner not too dissimilar to my own as she let out a sheepish chuckle. "Ahaha, I let off the wrong firework," she said. Her eye gained a gleam as she looked at me and let out a chilling smile that sent shudders down my spine. They were supposed to go off at the end of the match. I blinked. Then an involuntary smile spread across my face as my mouth went off, having found its cue. "Darling, I'm glad you thought that our first meeting should be accompanied by fireworks, but I hate to tell you, you're just not my type." Her chilling smile gained a mischievous quality as she let her hands rest on her hips, before slowly tracing them across the mesh and raising them until she was cupping her breasts. In a husky voice she breathed out, "Are you sure about that?" My eyes, like the eyes of every other male in that arena, I'm sure that included the Hokage, were locked on her hands. I literally had to wrench my face to raise my eyes, and for the first time in a while I actually had to force my brain to think up a comeback. After a second, I raised my palm and tilted it in a SOSO gesture. "I've seen better." "Oh?" She sensually licked her lips. "Sounds like my kind of woman." Well, shit. My brain went numb. lost in the imagery that sentence evoked. Touché. She grinned at her verbal victory and let her hands drop to her sides. Now that we're done with foreplay, shall we move on to heavy petting? But you haven't even bought me dinner, I full protested, but I had already lost the round, and the mocking smile she threw me showed that she knew it as well. The proctor visibly shook himself, then raised a hand. Final round, Tokubetsu Jonin Nanisher vs Tokubetsu Jonin Mitarashi Anko, Hajime. I braced myself for a taijutsu barrage, but I was instead shocked by a sudden rainfall of steel headed my way. I dodged and looked back only to find most of them vanishing as soon as they hit the ground/wall. Shuriken Kage Bunshin then. Well, I had something better. Before I managed to land, I created 3 clones in midair. Go nuts, guys. They speedily moved towards the snake summoner with kunai in their fists, as I dropped off to observe for a moment. Despite the fact that she was outnumbered, she did not appear at any moment to be overwhelmed. While her snake-style taijutsu was similar to Orochimaru's, he favored strength over speed. She preferred short, vicious strikes that were almost too fast to dodge. After a few exchanged blows, she twisted around one of the clone's strikes and dispelled it with a kunai through the eye, before flexibly using an overextended fist from another as a stepping stone and leapt into the air. Sanaijushu, hidden shadow snake hands, she called out as snakes extended from her hands and dispelled the clone she had as a springboard. As she landed, she bent over backwards, appearing not to have a spine, to avoid being decapitated, and in the same movement raised a foot and slammed it into the throat of the last clone. Damn. She spun the kunai around her finger as she called out, "Is that all you've got, shitstain?" Well. The grin on her face as she called out her challenge was a very familiar one. It spoke of a challenge to overcome, of limits to be pushed and broken, of a battle to be relished. It took me a moment to realize just where I had seen that grin before. Once I did, I felt goosebumps run down my arm as I cracked my neck and took up my stance. "Let's go, wild lady!" I exclaimed as I felt my old grin light up my face as if it had never left. Viewing gallery, Hatake Kakashi, Sarutobi Asuma and Marino Ibiki. Holy shit! Asuma exclaimed as he witnessed the terrifying brutality with which she took down the clones. Kakashi felt sure that if he had been smoking, the cigarette would have dropped from his mouth. Not that he had any room to poke fun. His own vice had been in his back pouch ever since they had taken their place in the arena. Ibiki's smile gained a sinister edge and Kakashi felt a thrill run down his spine. The violence had barely lasted 10 adrenaline-filled seconds, and yet it had got everyone's blood pumping. It seemed like this fight would be one for the record books. "Come on, you two, show me what you're capable of," Kakashi thought. Viewing gallery, Sarutobi Hiruzen. He certainly was not overestimating his skills. The thought was transitory, the mind of the third Hokage quickly readjusting to the battle below, a wry grin on his face as he watched Nanisher match Anko blow for blow. Although he had thought the blonde would be at least a little intimidated by Anko's initial dispatching of his shadow clones, the young woman as skilled and as fluid as her sensei's namesake, but it seemed to only fire up the time traveler. He watched in great interest as the two sized each other up before dashing towards the other, each retrieving a kunai into their right hands and lashing out accordingly as they drew closer. The metal knives clashed against each other, both of them trembling against the other, as the force each shinobi was putting into their attack was enough to strain the durability of the steel. Sarutobi wasn't the only one excited either. The fight audience, which to that point had been more or less silent from each shinobi's opening attacks, had now begun to act like overly excited academy students, cheering and taunting the two competitors as if it was some sort of game. It was an irony of sorts, considering it was a stadium full of shinobi, supposedly the silent dealers of death. Rather strange in every respect. Looks like they're about to step it up a notch, Sarutobi thought, eagerly awaiting the spectacle to follow. Arena. Our respective attack speeds had escalated as we traded blows in close quarters, as did our inherent risk-taking. As soon as I saw an opening, I dropped my kunai and grabbed her arm, yanking it hard to try and dislocate it before attempting to break it across my knee. For my troubles, I received a gash in the cheek by her kunai, splitting the mask apart. As soon as I tried to break her arm, though, she twisted out of my grasp and tried the backflip kick to the throat that had taken out my clone a few minutes ago. I had learned what to expect, though, and bent backwards to avoid the blow. She did another backflip after a single handstand and put some distance between us. As she looked at me, she brought up the kunai to her face and lewdly licked off my blood, coating it. Her voice went back to the same husky tone from earlier as she said, "You taste good, nameless wonder. I'll have to get more of that." A piercing whistle came out of the piercing gallery at that. The shudder that ran down my spine at that statement was not entirely unpleasant. My mouth decided it was time for round 2. "Does that mean you're free tonight, hot stuff?" There was more whistling and cheering at that, the crowd evidently enjoying the tete-a-tete as much as the fighting. Her grin widened, of course. The things I'm going to do to your balls after I cut them off. She let off a very suggestive moan at the thought. Unlike earlier, this time there were no mixed feelings about my shudder. The howls that came from the stadium crowd informed me that I had lost round 2 of the verbal spar. Somehow that annoyed me more than if I was losing the battle proper. Desperate to take the initiative, and maybe a little because I wanted to swipe that smirk off her face, I called out, "What say we move on from heavy petting to the hardcore stuff?" She gave a final lick to the kunai and idly asked, "What did you have in mind?" Time to show off, I thought to myself with a smirk of my own. In quick succession, with my left hand I threw 2 objects straight up, the second one impacting the first as soon as it reached the apex of its trajectory. I saw her tense her leg muscles, ready to dodge, but then stop in confusion as she made out the objects hanging in midair. One was an ordinary plastic half-liter bottle of water, and the other was the kunai piercing it, causing it to leak its contents. Locking my eyes onto her face, because I wanted to memorize her expression, and my left arm still raised, I called out with great satisfaction, "Suiton, Suryoden no Jutsu, water release, water dragon bullet technique." I could feel the jaws dropping around the arena. I performed a 44 hand seal technique with no visible hand seals whatsoever. Not to mention that the tiny half-liter of water had turned into a full-sized dragon made of water. It could not have been any larger had it been made on top of a river. The dragon had let out a roar as it shot towards Anko, who, to her credit, had only gaped at the sudden technique for a moment before jumping heavily to avoid said technique. Her eyes bulged and expression turned to one of disbelief as the technique maneuvered to follow her. She twisted to avoid it, but was only partially successful as the technique clipped her, causing her to spin around. Right into my fist. As her head snapped back, disorienting her, I pushed my advantage, immediately striking at her shoulder and sternum before attempting to knee her in the stomach. She had recovered by then and with a cough raised her arms to block my knee and push me back. As I regained my balance, she spat blood in my eye and charged forward as I flinched, landing an elbow in my face and a vicious uppercut to my chin that caused my neck to snap backwards with a horrible cracking sound that rang throughout the arena, even with the cheering from the stands, casing me to dispel. With almost perfect timing, as I received the memories from the clone, I leapt from beneath the earth intent on landing an uppercut of my own. However, the split second made the difference as she had already leapt into the air, throwing 2 kunai towards me and yelling out "Kunai Kage Bunshin." With a wrench of raw futon chakra, I ungainly changed directions in midair and landed in a heavy crouch with a huge grin on my face. I haven't had a fun spar like this in forever. Man, I wish I had gotten to fight with her before, I thought to myself. All of a sudden, I had to lean back to avoid another ankle, likely the original, leaping from beneath the earth to land another uppercut. I backflipped out of her reach in a move reminiscent of her own, but this was exactly what she had been waiting for. "Sanaijushu, hidden shadow snake hands." She called out victoriously as a bunch of snakes streamed from her sleeves and shot towards me, quickly wrapping around my body and hissing ominously. I mentally berated myself for letting my guard down during the fight and letting myself get caught up in the heat of the moment. We weren't pulling any punches either. A single moment of distraction had proven disastrous. Outwardly, however, I remained calm and let my mouth take over. "Somehow I knew you would be into bondage." Her smirk disappeared and the crowd roared its approval. Whether at my capture or at my barb, I didn't know. I decided to own it either way. "What, no whips and chains for your glorious moment? Why not a leather catsuit? The ensemble you have on is practically a dominatrix outfit already." There was more cheering at that. This round definitely went to me. Considering her frown, she knew it too. She squeezed the snakes binding me tighter and said ominously, "Give up now, shitstain. My snakes are already hungry. I'd hate it if one of them decided to take a bite out of you." The snakes hissed ominously, completing a rather scary effect. Too bad I had been exposed to worse. Interesting choice. How about I offer you another one instead? Futon or Raiton? She narrowed her eyes, noting that my arms were bound by my sides and therefore unable to make hand seals. I smirked and called out, "Raiton, Jibashi, lightning release, electromagnetic murder." She gave me a flat, unimpressed look, on that immediately changed to horror as lightning poured down my right arm and shocked her snakes, shocking her by conduction as well. She dispelled them at once, but didn't realize that she was standing in a puddle from my earlier Suryoden technique, a fact she was shockingly reminded of when she was electrocuted. She leapt away, her hair frazzled and a murderous expression on her face. She had taken too many heavy hits. By comparison, I had only been briefly captured. Understandably, she had lost her cool at this point. "I'm going to fucking cut your balls off, shitstain." She bit into one of her singed hands and started forming a very familiar set of hand seals. I frantically searched my pockets, still not used to which pocket had which item on this outfit, until I finally located the scroll I had meticulously prepared. Hoping I was not too late, I unfurled it quickly and slammed it into the ground, pouring way too much chakra into it in my haste. Simultaneous cries rang out around the arena: Kuchios no Jutsu, summoning technique. And Fuin Jutsu, Jigen Saiso Kuka Kengekihian, sealing technique, dimensional void seal. And all vision was obscured by the cloud from our techniques. Please tell me it worked in time, I mentally prayed as I waited for the smoke to clear. Since I didn't have my own summons, dealing with one from an opponent would have been a bitch. It would have made the battle significantly harder, and I wasn't sure I could keep the Haration a secret if I would have to fight two high-level opponents at the same time. I could always lose, but hey, fuck that. As the smoke finally cleared, I finally got a look at Anko and breathed a sigh of relief. She was surrounded by what appeared to be worms, but were actually tiny snakes wriggling around in the dirt. At the sight of her twitching, my mouth went off again. You must be a big hit at children's parties. Her hands started clenching uncontrollably, and I had no doubts that she was imagining throttling me. I'm sure that if a bunch of academy students got together and tried really hard, they would manage to do the exact same thing. The howls of laughter from the stands were music to my ears. Nanashi's mouth too, Anko too. Even though I had basically been kicking her ass for the second half of the fight, it was only now that I felt in control. What did you do? She bit out through clenched teeth, and I wasn't sure whether her twitching was a remnant of my right-hand technique, or her losing her cool. Either way, it was hilarious to see. I don't know if I should tell you. You've not been very nice to the new guy. She took a half step forward, expression absolutely murderous, and I called out in an annoying sing-song voice, fine, don't wrinkle your dominatrix outfit. The snickers from the peanut gallery nearly caused her to attack anyway, but she visibly held herself back. After letting the chuckles die away, I said I temporarily neutralized our link to the summon plane. I could hear some confusion from the stands, but it was clear Anko knew what I was talking about. Being the apprentice to the most infamous traitor Konoha had ever seen, especially one who was obsessed with every technique, she knew enough of the inner workings of the summoning technique. Most shinobi just provide the blood and perform the hand seals without knowing what they meant, but I had studied the Fuin Jutsu behind every hand seal and understood how it worked, therefore I knew how to disrupt it. I could see her raise her opinion of me, albeit grudgingly, but she looked like she was actually considering if further fighting would be to her benefit. I gave it another moment to see if she followed through with that thought, and gave up. It was at that moment that one of the tiny snakes tried to crawl up her leg. And failed. Probably because it was too weak. She looked at it for a long moment, and then looked up at me, and I knew there would be no victory by forfeit today. In fact, I would very shortly be fighting for my life. She completely lost her shit as she flew towards me, screaming out Kagebunshin no Jutsu, shadow replication technique. She recklessly attacked me with no semblance of form and barely a moment's thought to defense. Unfortunately for me, it was working. I had not fought an opponent with such criminal disregard for their own safety in years. She was very close to overwhelming me. Not to mention the crazed bloodlust in her eyes was actually freaking me out. Usually I goaded people into losing their cool because they made mistakes. She was one of the few exceptions to the rule because she was a berserker. Right before she got in what would surely be a critical hit, I threw a kunai with an explosive tag right at her feet. She had enough sense to jump backwards. Unfortunately for me, I didn't. I was very close to panicking. She needed to be taken out now before she got the upper hand, and I could only do that by doing something drastic. Say like jumping towards an explosion rather than away from it. Boom! As the shockwave and shrapnel hit me, even through the layer of futon chakra I had hastily erected as a shield, I closed my eyes until I was through the eye of the storm, so to speak. The second I felt the resistance disappear, I opened my eyes and quickly located Anko, who even in her enraged state was shocked to see me do something so stupid. I took advantage of the momentary reaction and sank my right fist into her stomach as hard as I could. With my left hand I pointed my palm at another nearby puddle. Suetun, Suiro no Jutsu, water release, water prison technique. Before she could do more than take a single shuddering breath after being winded, she was surrounded by the sphere that made up the technique. Give up, I said, coldly locking eyes with her. I will give her credit, she didn't as much as blink. The rage in her eyes was tempered, but she remained defiant. After a moment, she finally opened her mouth. That was when I realized that she had her hands locked in the Tora tiger seal. Instead of running away like a smart person, I let my jaw drop open at her sheer audacity. Trying to perform a katon, fire release, technique while surrounded by water? A second later, a fucking dragon made a fire shot while she was still surrounded by water. It instantly vaporized the water, and I finally thought about dodging, far too late. The napalm-like blaze hit me and I screamed in agony. Thankfully she didn't have enough breath or chakra to keep the technique going, so it stopped after a moment. Blisters were forming on her own skin from the boiling water, as she glared at me exactly the same way as she had from inside her watery confinement. After a second of rolling around on the ground to put out the flames, I got to my feet. You're fucking crazy, you know that? You're one to talk. Unlike the rest of the fight, her voice had no inflection whatsoever. It honestly creeped me out even more than the berserker state she had been in. Her eyes trailed over my arms and I realized that my tattoos were visible, courtesy of her fire dragon. They were nearly identical, the most obvious difference being that the ones on my left arm were blue, and the ones on my right were yellow. While she tried to decipher what they meant, a Kage Bunshin sneaked up on her and put his arm on her shoulder. She reacted violently, immediately thrusting out her hands to try and nail it in the throat. The Kage Bunshin dodged, but she kept up her attack. She had assumed that I was the one behind her and the one on the floor was a Kage Bunshin, since I had used that trick earlier. Unfortunately, she was proven wrong about 3 seconds later when she finally dispelled the clone. Her eyes widened as my hand landed on her shoulder and I called out once more, Raitan, Jibashi, lightning release, electromagnetic murder. I didn't go easy on the chakra output either, making sure she was well done, but not suffer any serious damage. Probably. After a few seconds of twitching and twisting under the technique I finally let go, she would have fallen to the ground had I not caught her bridal style. Her eyes still had a potent glare as she fought a losing battle with unconsciousness, and I was sure that had she been able to talk she would have threatened to cut off my balls for daring to make her look weak. Even as she passed out she made me shudder. After a few seconds of staring at her bedraggled appearance, making sure that the fight was well and truly over, I finally realized that the arena, which had been fairly thrumming with noise the entire time, was silent. I looked up to see everyone staring at me, and I started to squirm under the collective gaze. Maybe I went a little overboard. As I placed Anko gently on the ground I was finally rescued by the Sandaime Hokage, who stood up from his seat. Mitarashi Anko is unable to continue. Thus, the winner of this year's tournament is Nanisher. Thunderous applause burst out from the crowd, who had been thoroughly entertained. I let out a grin and a casual wave this time as the medical ninjas came out with a stretcher and started loading the unconscious Anko on it. As they beckoned for me to follow I kept my distance from the stretcher. I think I'm going to avoid her for a while. I like my balls too much. 7 days later, Udacure. I sighed in satisfaction as I finished the saucer of sake. This was the good stuff. Perhaps entering the tournament had been a good idea after all. Well, winning it anyway provided the rest and relaxation that I don't think I've had in years. Not since Hinata died anyway. Or would die in the future. That I would prevent. But she still wouldn't be my Hinata whatever. Time travel was confusing. Not to mention frustrating. Actually, all things considered, it was a good thing that I was away from the village for the time being. Sarutobi and I hadn't exactly parted on the best of terms. /*flashback. What do you mean I'm not going to be promoted to Jonin? Are you seriously going senile? I beat Kakashi. Who was a total plant, by the way. Don't think I don't know that. What more am I supposed to do? The old man touched the tip of his hat in an exasperated gesture, but the amusement in his eyes was clear as daylight. I had termed this his troll face. Jonin are supposed to be the best shinobi in the village. And I beat the so-called best in the village. How does that not qualify me? I interrupted. Perhaps if you let me finish. There was a flash of irritation in his movement this time, and I crossed my arms in a huff. I'm not proud of it, but I was genuinely annoyed. Jonin are the best shinobi in the village. That means that they have shown that they are adept in all the basic ninja arts of ninjutsu, genjutsu, and taijutsu. You have shown that you are adequate at taijutsu and ninjutsu. He ignored my outraged sputter at the term adequate, but you have shown next to no skill in genjutsu. Furthermore, he raised his voice as I made to interrupt again. You have only shown some skill in the futon element. Jonin are supposed to be skilled in at least 2. I was beyond outraged sputters at this point. My mouth was literally hanging open in complete disbelief. It took me a few moments to find my voice. When it came out, it was so high and petulant that it would have made me cringe if it hadn't been completely appropriate for the injustice I was suffering. Are you shitting me, old geezer? It took me another few minutes before I could calm myself and think logically. I have undergone a little baptism of fire in Fuinjutsu. I made my body go through a completely untested ritual in order to master elements without the use of hand seals. Not to mention that a similar ritual was needed to make me immune to genjutsu. Immune? That includes the freaking Mangekyo Sharingan techniques. I've pushed the boundaries of Fuinjutsu further than anyone else before me. How the fuck does that not count for anything? He stared at me for a minute, and then said in a perfect deadpan, if only there was a rank for people who could go toe-to-toe with other jonin without having all of their skills. I banged my head against his desk. Twice, thrice, but I overdid it the 4th time. Ow. He smiled indulgently at me. Jonin are also nominated by their to-be peers. This means that you need to also have a good rapport with your superiors, and subordinates as well. To be nominated as a Jonin means that the shinobi forces feel safe putting their lives under your command. That trust must be earned. Also, being a Jonin means that you are obligated to test an academy team. If one of them has an affinity towards genjutsu, do you think that you will be able to start them on their way to greatness? Once again, the old man showed me why he was the Hokage. There was a lot more to it than being the strongest in the village. That included dealing with people who genuinely thought that they had good reasons to demand something, but failed to look underneath the underneath, kind of like I was doing at the moment. Smiling as he realized that I had finally grasped the gist of the matter, he continued, as for ninjutsu, you need to physically train two elements. Not only does this strengthen the potency of your chakra, you will also be able to help potential students on their way, should you choose to take a team. Your skills in Fuinjutsu are indeed impressive. Unfortunately, it is not enough for me to justify a promotion at this time. This time I tried to look underneath the underneath from his point of view. I was certain he wasn't just talking about the promotion. He was saying that I had lost my 2 trump cards in the QB and Sage mode and needed to get stronger by more conventional means to stand a chance for the battles that were to come. That didn't mean I was going down within a fight though. What about Guy? I asked triumphantly. He shrugged. Guy has mastered everything he could despite his handicap. He could not be a better shinobi if he tried. Despite his eccentricities, he is a supremely capable ninja, and his peers felt that letting him take command would be beneficial, and I agreed. Guy has proved to us that we're right. He had systematically deconstructed all of my arguments, leaving me with no choice. Stingy! I declared petulantly, pointing my finger at him. He let out a genuine, surprised laugh at that. Wiping the tears of laughter at that, he said, I see that you haven't improved your repertoire from when you were a child. If the shoe fits. It is indeed good to see that underneath everything you are still Naruto. It took me a moment to process that statement. Instead of smiling like I should have, it just left me confused. After another moment, I spoke, say that again. With a slight tilt of his head to signify his confusion, he repeated, it is indeed good to see that underneath everything you are still Naruto. Once more, I felt confused by that statement. After another moment, I realized just what had confused me and my stomach dropped. I hung my head and whispered desperately, call me by that name again. Naruto. I drew in a deep, shuddering breath. The effect was the same as when he called me Nanashir. That's not my name anymore. I raised my head and locked eyes with him. His eyes widened as he understood the gravity of what I was saying. This was unprecedented. Just who was I? And more importantly, what was I? After a few depressing minutes where I stared out at the village, I looked back at him. It was time to decide what to do about the piece that would decide the whole game. I had put it off long enough. What are we going to do about Sasuke? He looked at me with his fingers forming a steeple in front of his face. After a deliberate silence, he spoke slowly, what you have told me is indeed disturbing. To betray everything he held dear, to tear down everything he once loved, to kill those he once called friends, it is a shame he was manipulated until he snapped. My face twisted in disgust. Despite everything he is capable of, you would do nothing? His voice held a warning tone as he replied, I cannot condone killing a 10-year-old child just because he may turn out to be a traitor. While there is still a chance, I would rather have such a powerful figure on our side. Helping him get over his trauma will benefit us in the long run. My decision is final. I tried to calm myself. I truly tried, but it was an exercise in futility. The ringing in my ears grew louder and my hands clenched as I took pointless deep breaths. You coward! The silence that followed my statement was deafening. I could barely believe I had said it, but the shocked look on the face of the Hokage was proof that I hadn't just hallucinated saying those words. I tried taking another deep breath, but it didn't help at all. My trembling fists and the sweat under my armpits was proof of that. You would risk everything in the naive hope that an Uchiha would redeem himself and save us all? Have you completely lost your mind? I roared. Sarutobi's shocked look had disappeared, to be replaced by a closed expression. For someone who claims to hate Danzo and his methods, you are remarkably quick to suggest execution as a preferred means of solving a problem, he remarked cuttingly. I smiled unpleasantly under my mask. Oh yes, speaking of the Uchiha, how is dear Danzo doing? Still diddling himself with all the Sharingan he stole off the Uchiha corpses? After he more or less orchestrated their betrayal to achieve exactly that? You didn't drop the ball there at all, did you? My smile grew feral as I let out the fatal blow, just like you handled the Hyuga incident with Kumo perfectly. Sarutobi's eyes were like molten steel at this point as he stared at me in absolute rage. But I wasn't done. If you expect me to adhere to this order, he actually let out raw killing intent at that, but I was unimpressed, I am going to install a failsafe. I'm placing a permanent Horatian marker on him, so that when he inevitably betrays us I can kill him before he hurts anyone else. The Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure, adorned with his Kage hat, glared at me with a thunderous expression on his face. Get out. I let out a mocking bow, Hokage-sama. End flashback */ Not, perhaps, my finest hour. I had no idea why I had flown off the handle. Scratch that, I knew why. It was because Sasuke was a traitorous murdering piece of crow shit that deserved to have his balls shoved into his eye sockets. No, what I was worried about was the fact that I had been having such uncharitable thoughts about the Sandaime. I had always looked up to him with the greatest respect. Throwing his biggest failures in his face was far beyond the line. Considering the mood I had been in, I'm surprised I hadn't thrown Orochimaru in his face. The fluffy white bathrobe I had on made for a very soft handkerchief as I mopped up a little dribble of sake that had spilled down the side of my mouth. Maybe it wasn't even Sasuke that had made me lose my composure. The revelation that I wasn't even a version of Naruto had seriously unsettled me. The pieces of my time travel journey were adding up to a very ugly picture, and I barely had a fraction of the pieces. I mean, unless I was supposed to understand murderous smiles, I couldn't recall the Shinigami communicating with me. I repressed a shudder as I recalled that smile and automatically made myself think of other thoughts, anything to avoid thinking about the god who embodied death. I had a lot of practice after all. As I finished my sake, I thought about what I still needed to do. I still had to mark Sasuke with the permanent Horatian seal once I got back to the village. There was no way I would have done it in the state of mind I had been in at the time I had left the Hokage's office. I would have slit his throat and damned the consequences. But this was a delicate time. Who knew how Orochimaru would react if his prized body would have been destroyed? Not to mention how Itachi would react? That was something I had overlooked while thinking about killing the little fucker, but no doubt the Sandaime had. He was smart like that, probably why he had been chosen as Hokage to begin with. It didn't mean that I was wrong about what I had said though. He had been slipping, making decisions that seemed to involve the least amount of bloodshed but no doubt made Konoha look weak. But looking at it from his point of view, he had done his duty and named his successor before retiring to a life of peace. After all, Namake's Minato was supposedly the chosen one according to the Toads who would bring the shinobi nations to peace. Perhaps the Sandaime was trying to live up to a legacy that was not his to begin with. In any case, the village, which was still the strongest in terms of numbers, was suffering due to the big decisions. The everyday working Sarutobi had got right, but the big decisions were not going the right way. And how fucked up was it that even I thought that Danzo had a good point when he claimed that the leadership of the Sandaime was driving us to ruin. Sarutobi had been good friends with Danzo in their youth. To see him go from the Kami no Shinobi to this meek turn-the-other-cheek character must have been particularly galling to him. No wonder Danzo thought that he would do better in his stead. He hadn't lost his ruthlessness. This thought process was pointless though. I knew where it would end up leading the village. Merely understanding the why was not enough. Action was needed. With that thought in mind, I firmly stood up and started walking purposefully. I had an appointment with a massage therapist to keep. 2 hours later. Warm. Gooey. I felt like I would melt. I felt like a chocolate left on the countertop on that perfect day when it's not too hot but it melts the second you touch it, and it wraps around your finger. I could hardly believe how amazing a simple massage was. No wonder people paid a fortune to come to these places. I felt like I was floating in the clouds just from a few simple touches from another human being, and no chakra was involved. I couldn't even remember the last time I had been touched, outside of a spa. Probably the last time had been with Sakura-chan, and that was a long time after Hinata had been brutally murdered. Even that small happiness hadn't lasted too long though, Orochimaru had seen to that. But as she died I had made sure that I thoroughly burned her corpse and scattered the ashes, just like I had with Hinata. They were perhaps the only shinobi who I hadn't fought after they died. And what was with me getting all morose all the time? I had a chance to make sure it didn't happen again for Log's sake. And my body was thankfully not listening to the bullshit my head was spouting, so I started to enjoy the nice relaxing feeling again. It was bliss. I had earned it, and I was going to enjoy it, damn it. I set out to explore the village, which had once been a full-fledged hidden village before they decided to go the peaceful route. It seemed like a typical quiet, small town with next to no security. The residents probably didn't even lock their doors when they weren't home. I wandered around, crossing a few residents before entering the local cemetery. I suppose it had been because I had been thinking about the Hinata and Sakura-chan that I wandered over to the cemetery. I mean, it's not like anyone I knew was buried there. Perhaps it was a way to remember those who had been precious to me, and I had been unable to save. My body was still tingling from the massage, but it was muted now. As I walked through the silence of the graveyard I saw a hooded figure standing in front of a roughly hewn stone. It seemed that the burial was recent. In fact, the entire body had been buried, as opposed to just the ashes. What drew me to the figure was the way it stood, the way it grieved. The way I had once stood. I walked closer until I was a respectful distance away. The figure gave no visible acknowledgement that I was near. After a few minutes I broke the silence. It hurts. Understatement of the century, but the figure didn't as much as twitch. The pain of losing the one you love the most hurts far worse than anything else. Still no reaction from the figure, but I couldn't not say the next words. That doesn't mean you should kill yourself. I could have sworn that the figure shivered for a moment, but I couldn't be sure. I've stood exactly where you're standing. Twice I let myself love another. Twice she was taken from me. I let my gaze drop. Twice I was forced to cremate them alone. Twice I contemplated joining them in the afterlife. Given what I had suffered through, perhaps I should have, but that was not what this person needed to hear. Twice I almost followed through. Do you know what stopped me? The figure gave me no indication that I had even started speaking, yet I knew it was listening intently. As soon as I imagined meeting them in the afterlife, the first thing they would do was slap me. I let the statement hang in the air for a few moments, letting its gravity wash through. For some reason they always thought that someone else would need me more than I needed them. I never bought it, but then again I've always been kind of stupid, you know? Maybe they were right. Maybe the reason I'm here is to stop you from doing what I almost did. I stretched, letting my limbs start tensing up again. The massage had been divine, but I couldn't let my guard down. I wasn't in my home country after all. Or maybe I'm just sticking my nose where it doesn't belong. Either way, I came to the cemetery because I was missing them. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. But do think about what I said, okay? I turned around and started walking back towards the village proper. I turned back once at the entrance, to see the figure with a hand raised in front of its chest in a distinctly feminine gesture. I figured it was a guy. Shrugging, I continued on my way. I had a last day of vacation to enjoy after all. Back in the cemetery, Komatsu Sayuri's eyes were wide with terror. How did that man see through my genjutsu? The moment she was sure she was alone, the former kunoichi from Getsugeikure, village hidden under the moon, ran. She drew the strange chakra that was everywhere around her as a genjutsu cloak, even though it was useless against the shinobi from the cemetery. She pumped her own chakra into the genjutsu as well, so much so that it was overcharged. A capable sensor would be able to detect her, but in her panic she didn't think about it. It's impossible, she thought to herself frantically, still freaking out about the near miss. Since when were Konoha shinobi able to break through her genjutsus like that? Even members of the Uchiha clan, back when they were around, had been unable to see through the genjutsus she was able to weave. She was so good at them she had managed to stay out of every bingo book. Never had she met anyone who had simply managed to walk up to her when she was cloaked. It had been the single most terrifying moment of her life when that man started talking to her as if he didn't even realize that she was under a genjutsu. It was not a common technique. She was the only person capable of using it. Once she had tried to teach a student how to use it, but he had ended up being turned to stone. Freaking stone of all things. She had blamed it on an attack by an IWA shinobi. Thankfully her word wasn't questioned further. She had fallen in love with a traveling merchant, a civilian who hadn't minded her looks. She was ugly, with her beady eyes and round belly and skinny arms. Unkind children used to call her a spider as a child. But the love of her life never once minded her looks, and she had loved him for it. When he asked her to come with him, she barely hesitated, leaving behind a replica of her body which showed signs of poisoning. Let them make of it what they would. They had never understood exactly how powerful she was and had underestimated her. She owed them nothing. She left with no regrets, and had lived a happy life. Until yesterday. She had stayed behind in the previous village to run a few errands, urging her husband to go on, convincing him that there were no reported bandits in the area, he would be fine. He had agreed readily, and they promised to meet in a day that would never come. The feeling of utter devastation she had felt when she saw the destroyed remains of the caravan's retinue could only be described as quiet. She felt no rage, did not swear eternal vengeance on the perpetrators. Her world quietly collapsed, as she silently picked up the body of her dead husband and started walking towards the nearest town. She silently stalked into the nearest funeral home and stole the first coffin she saw and carried it to the cemetery. With a generous application of chakra she quickly dug the grave and then laid her special brand of genjutsu over it, in case the land was reserved. As she had nothing tying her down anywhere, she had indeed been contemplating ending her own life when she had been interrupted. It had been the single most terrifying event in her life, and the person talking to her hadn't even realized it. She had to get away from that place before the shinobi realized that something was wrong. She realized that she had been caught up in her musings when the world suddenly tilted on its axis. As the ground rushed up to meet her, she realized, far too late, that for the first time in over a decade her panic and carelessness had allowed her to be caught. An indeterminate amount of time later. As she came to, her old instincts immediately flared to life. She made sure her breathing pattern or her heartbeat didn't change, while she tried to sense how many people were nearby. Nah, Itachi-san, she thinks she can fool us into thinking she's still asleep. Horror spread throughout her being as she snapped open her eyes and crouched in a defensive position. Her eyes snapped up and widened in shock as she met the red eyes of her opponent. The Sharingan. This meant that the speaker was right. This was Uchiha Itachi. A boy who, at the age of 14, had single-handedly slaughtered one of the foremost clans in the world, a clan that had not only survived, but flourished even in the Warring States period. As she finally got over her shock, she looked at the person who had spoken, and her heart sank even further at the sight of blue skin, eyes beadier than her own, and a trademark shark-like grin. The Samahata-wielding Hashigaki Kisame. There was no point in fighting, she wouldn't last a second against these two. She instantly wove her special brand of genjutsu around herself, with none of her own chakra mixed in this time, and was pleased to see that both of them clearly lost sight of her. Kukukuka, how very interesting. With a feeling of dread, she slowly turned around, only to be greeted by 7 spectral figures. All the 9 people wore the same black cloak with red clouds, and the one who had tittered was clearly Orochimaru. Her heart was hammering in her chest as she gazed upon what was basically the who's who of S-rank Nukenin. She had no chance in hell against these monsters, even escaping looked to be beyond her. Not a single shinobi in her entire lifetime had managed to break through her genjutsu, and now it had happened twice in one day. Actually, that wasn't quite true. She could tell the way she took a hesitant step that nobody had reacted. Even the 2 in the flesh behind her hadn't realized she was moving. Just as she thought she could make a break for it, a something grew out of the ground, something wearing the same cloak as the other 9 figures. It opened, akin to a Venus flytrap, and the 2 Siamese twins inside looked straight at her. Scratch that, it had happened twice in one day. We are Akatsuki, one of the holographic specters said. She looked at the figure. It undoubtedly had a dojutsu of some sort, the ripple pattern in the eyes all but screamed it. We invite you to join us. What? After taking a deep, shaky breath, in a trembling voice Sayuri asked, why? The figure's eyes narrowed. Because your skills can be of value to us. I will not ask again. She dropped her gaze from the figure who was undoubtedly the leader. Death threats will not work on me. I have nothing to live for anymore. The only person who cared for me is dead. A few hours ago I was on the verge of taking my own life. So go ahead, do your worst. The cold rippled eyes looked at her, looked through her, judging her. She raised her chin. She was not going to die in fear. After a moment that lasted an eternity, the figure finally spoke. When was this person killed? She blinked. One of the other members swung her head to stare at the leader, but didn't speak. Sayuri finally spoke, almost a day. After another pregnant pause, where the leader stared at Sayuri with those unblinking eyes, he finally asked, where is the body? Pain. The female member of Akatsuki with gray eyes exclaimed. You cannot be considering. The leader, evidently named Pain, simply looked at the kunoichi. While that was apparently enough to silence her, he still said it would be best if she learned firsthand the true power of a god. He turned back to Sayuri. Return to the grave. It was an order, and she disliked orders. However, she had no choice, what with the 3-4 people who were physically with her. Unnerved by the stares from the entire Akatsuki body, she nodded her assent and took down the genjutsu. Kukukuki, you simply must tell me how you use that fascinating technique when we meet. She visibly shuddered at the creepy tone of the snake Sannin. First chance she got she would ditch these lunatics. They actually followed a guy who had a freaking god complex. The specters wavered and disappeared, and remaining figures all looked at her with the same predatory look. Sayuri was seriously considering making a break for it, when Kisame hefted his ginormous sword and chuckled, Itachi-san, should I shave off a leg to make sure that she doesn't run? Itachi's Sharingan, which had not left her visage since she had woken up, spun ominously. I don't believe our guest would be so rude. She shuddered. Running was out. Might as well see what this circus was about. As they trudged their way back, the weird plant tree man thing had disappeared. She wondered what exactly they wanted from her. Sure, they wanted her skills, but this was clearly an organization of S-rank shinobi. She was nowhere near the caliber of any of them fighting wise. What exactly would they use her skills for? And in the case of Orochimaru, How exactly would she manage to keep away from that creep? Before she knew it, they had arrived back at the cemetery. The weird plant tree man thing had even identified the grave, probably by using its unique chakra, and dug it up. Thankfully, though, they hadn't opened the casket. She could appreciate the small amount of respect they had shown. "Can we open it, please?" No, the plant tree man thing spoke to itself, its either half. It took a second to realize that they were in fact separate people. "We'll just take a small bite. You know you won't stop at a single bite. Wait for Leader-sama." She shuddered. Holy shit, the plant tree man thing was a fucking cannibal. And it wanted to eat her husband. She started squirming, but one look showed that Itachi still hadn't moved his eyes away. Neither had Kisame, but his humongous sword was moving and whispering? What was with these freaks? The last shinobi in the village left. "We're on our own now," Kisame informed the rest of the group. "Great. Even the weird guy who had started this whole thing won't be coming to help me. I might as well tell them to kill me now and be done with it." Just as she was about to open her mouth, the attention of her kidnappers simultaneously turned to the sky. Rather than take advantage of the momentary distraction, she did the same, and let her jaw drop open. The leader was flying. He was freaking flying. And not even using a futon technique to do so. No wonder he had a freaking god complex. He landed gracefully near them, on the other side of the coffin. With a gesture from him, the coffin's cover was lifted off. Sayuri stepped forward, completely confused at this point. What the hell was going on? The blank expression on her dead husband's face simply drove her to more sorrow. "Witness the power of a god," the leader with the god complex, Pain, said. He raised his hand and said majestically, "Geto, Rinna Tensei no Jutsu, Outer Path, Sasra of Heavenly Life Technique." Whatever Sayuri had been expecting, this was not it. A gigantic otherworldly head popped into existence mere feet from them, and it was enough to scare a few years off her. That thing dealt with death, and the last place she wanted to be was next to it. But before she could move, it opened its mouth. Something green shot out and entered the body of her dead husband. His wounds disappeared. His color returned. And then he took a breath and opened his eyes. "Shiba-kun!" she exclaimed, her voice high-pitched. Was this actually possible? "Huh! Saya-chan? You're here!" But the bandits he sat up to examine his non-existent wounds, but was interrupted by a bawling Sayuri, who noisily cried as she held on to her resurrected and extremely confused husband. After a few minutes of crying and Shiba patting his wife on the back, he finally asked, "Why am I in a coffin?" At this, Sayuri let go of her husband and wiped her face. Then she walked over to where Pain was standing and fell to her knees, and fresh tears started pouring down her face. She bowed until her forehead touched the ground at his feet, and said, "Kami-sama. My life is yours. My loyalty is yours. Whatever you need, whenever you need, please tell me and I will do it or die trying." Pain smiled. 2 days later, Kanahigakure, Konoha Hospital. His head hurt. As he tried to open his eyes and touch the back of his head, he realized he was not in his training ground. The white walls and the smell of fennel in the air was identified the location as the hospital. He hadn't been in the hospital since that night. As he looked out the window, the parallel to that fateful night only grew. It was a full moon, and he had trained himself practically into the ground. He shuddered as the sense of foreboding grew cancerously in his chest. He started hyperventilating and the machine next to his bed started beeping loudly, prompting a nurse to rush in and start running a diagnostic jutsu on him. The fact that there was another live human being next to him helped, as did the lack of copious amounts of blood, and he started taking deep breaths to calm himself down. After a few moments, the beeping returned to a lower volume as well as a lower frequency, and the nurse asked, "Are you all right? I can't find anything physically wrong with you." As soon as he was sure his voice wouldn't tremble, he spoke, "Nothing's wrong." For a minute I thought he clamped his mouth shut. Idiot, he mentally berated himself, and looked away from the nurse and the pitying expression that she was undoubtedly sporting. After a few moments of silence, the nurse spoke in that kind and soft tone that he absolutely despised. "You apparently slipped and hit your head during training. Luckily a passing shinobi found you and brought you to us. Thankfully the wound was minor, and you don't appear to have a concussion, so you should be fine. We're keeping you overnight for observation. You'll be free to go in the morning." He grit his teeth and started to shake his head, but a stab of pain cut the movement short. After a moment, recalling the fuss made over him during his last visit, he bit out through clenched teeth, "Fine." The nurse smiled. He could hear it in her voice. "Excellent. Ring the buzzer if you need anything, and someone will be over in a jiffy." Stubbornly, he didn't react to the statement at all, and only raised his head once he heard the door close behind the nurse. He kept his back ramrod straight even after she had left. Members of his clan didn't slouch. He did let out a sigh as his gaze went back to the full moon outside his window. Clearly sleep was going to be a long time coming, if it came at all. His jaw twitched as he recalled the simpering pity from the nurse. It was honestly a bigger problem than just her. Everywhere he went, whether it was the grocer or his academy sensei, they all treated him like he would a delicate piece of china that was about to break. It was no use, everything led back to the fateful night. He recalled the full moon in the sky and the unnerving silence as he stepped into the clan compound. He remembered the blood in the streets as horror overtook him. He remembered the terror at finding his parents' bodies, and the utter disbelief at the fact that his brother was the one to kill them. He remembered the pain his brother inflicted on him as he remorselessly showed their murders over and over. He remembered the prophetic words his brother spoke to him before discarding him like weak trash. He remembered chasing after him and flinging kunai at him with near-lethal accuracy, knocking his Hittite off. Wait, what? He shook his head, trying to clear the false memories away, trying to ignore the pain from his headache. That had not happened. Why was he thinking that? After all, there was no way Uchiha Itachi was crying after killing his clan, right? Later that night, Hokage's office, Konoha, Sarutobi Hiruzen. The progressively louder sound of the rhythmic tapping of a cane made the Sandaime Hokage aware of his impending visitor. To be honest, he was surprised that his erstwhile colleague had taken as long as he had to visit him. He was certain that the topic of this visit would be the time traveler, not that his guest knew about that. It was already the middle of the night, but today was the day Nanisher had returned, and he was sure that the Fuinjutsu specialist would have marked the Uchiha heir. Watching through his crystal ball, he observed a hidden Nanisher knocking out the boy in the middle of a training session by carefully applying a precise blast of futon chakra under his foot, while midair, and making the boy lose his balance. He proceeded to shave off a patch of Sasuke's hair, before using a kunai and adding his own blood to a seal on the back of his head, all the while the ANBU who were guarding him were just waiting for the blonde to make a wrong move. Had Nanisher done so, and killed the boy as he had requested, the ANBU were under orders to kill the nameless shinobi. Whether they would have been able to carry out those orders was another matter though. Thankfully Nanisher not caused any such problems. Given the depths to which the boy would sink, installing a failsafe was a prudent precaution. What he regretted was the way the conversation with the blonde had devolved into a shouting match. But this was not the time to delve into that can of worms. He would need all his wits for this meeting. The door creaked open, even though it was perfectly oiled. He internally frowned at the sense of melodrama that Danzo loved to express. To be fair though, it was the only piece of personality that the old warmonger allowed himself to demonstrate publicly. As he made his way into the room, the Hokage refused to turn away from the window, still looking out over the village that he had spent his lifetime serving. The moonlight gave it a soft and peaceful glow, but there was danger everywhere, especially in his own office at the moment. He was very aware of Danzo's gaze at his back, but he wasn't going to make the first move. Even a simple thing like a conversation between old colleagues could prove treacherous. He would have to watch his words very carefully. Danzo took his time as he carefully seated himself, before, as he expected, making the first move. I heard that you put a tracking seal on the Uchiha boy. I see, so that's his game, Sarutobi thought to himself. His first thought was to ask Danzo about his sources, since the only people present were the ANBU, but he would come off looking defensive. He would have to put the ball back into Danzo's court. I did. Shimura Danzo was no fool. During Sarutobi's first reign they had been very close professionally. He had been a regular advisor to the Hokage during the Second and Third Shinobi Wars. He had actually been in charge of the ANBU for large periods. That was where his root division had been born, and the successes of the early version were enough to ensure its continuance. Danzo would not have lasted as long as he had if he hadn't been extremely effective at his job. A large part of that was recognizing that he needed to have a symbiotic relationship with his friend and superior. It was something that required implicit trust between them. And throughout his first reign as the Sandaime, Sarutobi had let Danzo take care of the dirty side of the business, only reining him when it became necessary. Individually, they both knew that they weren't worthy of the Nidaime Hokage, Senju Tobirama, but together they surpassed him. It had been the most effective partnership in Konoha's history, and a consequence of that was that both men knew the other like the back of their hands. That was the reason why Danzo was intrigued. Ever since Sarutobi had returned to the seat, he had not been the force of nature, as he was during his first reign. He had made sloppy decisions that cost Konoha a lot of face politically, the Hyuga affair being the most prominent. He had turned into a pacifist during his retirement, and while Konoha could coast on its laurels for a while, a stronger figure was needed. This decision, the one to mark the sole remaining Uchiha in case of a betrayal, spoke of a degree of cynicism that Sarutobi had not shown since returning. The fact that the unknown nameless shinobi with the clearly fake mission history had been the one to mark him spoke volumes about who was driving the decision. Danzo was here to find out just why Sarutobi was letting someone else call the shots. And of course this was the one time Sarutobi had found his spine. He had not been this difficult in years. Danzo was certain that he had not shown such resolve during any time in the past few years. That shows a remarkable amount of foresight for someone at your age. The barb at his age was a feint. They both knew what Danzo was referring to as the fact that he was not as strong as before. My bones may be old, but my mind remains as sharp as ever. Finally, the Hokage turned around as he made his way to the desk and sat down pointedly behind the desk, before fixing Danzo with a steely stare. You would do well to remember that. So after making a few significant mistakes, you finally decide to change your tune? All men make mistakes. Have you made any yourself recently? Such as disobeying orders, perhaps? The Sandaime immediately returned the barb. Insulting the Hokage was crossing the line, even for the old warmonger. Danzo allowed a grim smile to cross his face. So you finally noticed. The old Sarutobi would never have taken anyone at their word, not even me, let alone get away with it for so long. What has caused you to finally wake up from your slumber, I wonder? We're both too old to play that game, Danzo. Put your cards on the table. Who is he? This time it was Sarutobi who let a grim smile cross his face. I thought that he was joking when he said nobody would find a trace of him. I imagine that you must be quite consternated to find out that this was true. Danzo continued, ignoring Sarutobi. His appearance suggests a familiar relationship to the deceased Yondaime. His chakra signature is similar to our Jinchuriki, further proving that this must be the case. However, I myself vetted the Hokage well before his coronation. I found no such trace of a family. Who is he? And more importantly, why do you trust him? Danzo was comfortable with this sort of talk. He was a blunt man. He was not half the politician that Sarutobi was. While he was adept at deciphering the hidden meanings behind somebody's words, he was not as comfortable talking that language day in and day out. He was much more at ease digging in the background, sussing out the nature of people and their secrets. Subtle interrogations were not his forte. He believed in torture as a preferred means of gathering information when the usual investigations yielded no significant results. Directly asking his subjects questions was a luxury that he rarely enjoyed. His identity and my reasons to trust his information is an S-rank secret, one that is more valuable than the truth behind the Uchiha massacre. While on the surface, the statement didn't reveal much, one thing was readily apparent. The Hokage had implied that he trusted the information provided by this Nanisher, not the ninja himself. Secondly, the intelligence was far more valuable than something that could lose Konoha a lot of goodwill, and by extension clients. That Sarutobi was even telling him this much was indicative of how valuable it was, and Danzo's curiosity was piqued. As he processed this, Danzo leaned back. The fact that Sarutobi trusted him even after knowing that he had disobeyed his order to disband would be called heartwarming by those that believed in emotions. To him, it was a weakness to be exploited, and he proceeded to do so immediately. What is it about? If he couldn't know what it was, then perhaps he could find out what it was about. He could carry out his own investigations from there. Instead of answering, Sarutobi raised his fingers in front of his head in their characteristic steeple and said, I gave you an order 2 years ago. It is time you carried it out. Dismantle me. I will not ask again. Sarutobi was still gazing at him with that characteristic steely gaze. Danzo was more than intrigued. While Sarutobi's persona and mastery over his body language was typically flawless, he knew the old monkey well enough to realize that Sarutobi was excited about whatever he had learned. It was a genuine game changer. Whoever this shinobi was, he had brought out the fire in Sarutobi, the fire that had been missing for years. He wondered how he could get Sarutobi to hint at what he had learned, but he knew Sarutobi well enough to understand this one would be played close to the chest. He wondered once again how he could use the emotional goodwill that Sarutobi had towards him, and if it would get him results. Because his only other option was Kodo Amatsukami, distinguished heavenly gods. The next day. It was the day of the Konoha annual Grand Sports Festival. The participation came from the genin teams, but festivals meant that people would come out during the evening to enjoy the atmosphere, the food and the entertainment. I was one of the revelers, even though I didn't deserve it. Why? I hadn't gone to the mission hall today, mostly because I was being a coward about facing the Hokage. I could brush it off by saying I had a late night when I came back, putting a seal on Sasuke, but that was if I could make myself go to the mission hall tomorrow. As it was, today was a training day, and I had to work hard to get back my edge. A week off had slightly dulled it. I had made plans to meet up with Gima, with whom I had trained off and on before the tournament. Our spars made a reliable yardstick of my recovery after I had been discharged from the hospital, and I had to say that I liked the guy. I had known him for a little while back in my own time. He had taught me the basics of the Horatian, having learned it from my esteemed father himself. After he had been killed, I had to figure out the rest myself, but I remembered that him to be a self-confident and easygoing character. Getting to know him as a peer this time was almost no different, only the jokes we cracked were more age-appropriate. The Sandane was right in saying that I needed more friends my age. Even though he was a meddlesome old coot, he was right in his choice of companion for me. I found him with his back against a lamppost and a half-smile, making eyes at a passing damsel. I shook my head as I drew near. "Still getting shot down, man-whore?" I shot good-naturedly. His smile turned into one of amusement. "They won't be able to resist my charms for too long." He pushed off the post and fell into step beside me. "Quite a large turnout tonight." "Yeah. It's nice to see all the civilians excited too. Particularly after what I had been through, there had been precious little to celebrate. I do love the way they go through the effort of dressing up. They look far more attractive this way." "The men too? Haven't we already established that my eyes are only drawn to the female form? What about other parts of your anatomy?" He smirked. "Why, are you jealous? Would you like me to proposition you too?" Ugh, I had left myself open to that one. "Fine. You win. Now let's go eat food that isn't phallic in appearance. I'm starving." "Well said. I'm sure to need my energy later on in the night." I smiled in exasperated amusement. "Do you ever stop?" That's what my dates ask me during fun time, and in a few minutes they usually forget about the question. Because they leave in disgust? Let's just say their minds take a trip, while they leave their bodies behind. "Did you just confess to drugging and taking advantage of helpless women?" He snorted. "Please. You're just jealous of my prowess. It isn't like there's a line of women after you." I opened my mouth, no doubt to say something snappy, but instead, shit. I immediately turned around. "Let's go to another row." He looked around in confusion, before he spotted an obviously on-duty Mitarashi Enko. He turned around, and I didn't need to look at him to know that he was smirking. "Oh? A lover's quarrel?" I snorted this time. As if. "I like my balls where they are, thank you very much." His eyes gleamed as he pressed on. "Oh? I didn't take you for the type who runs away from his battles. It's called a tactical retreat. I'm not going to face her while she's still mad about losing. I'm sure I will at some point, say 10 years from now. That is one freakishly scary lady." He chuckled. The only part of that statement Enko would disagree with is being called a lady. Well, I have enough self-preservation instinct not to try and find out. He chuckled, but let it go. We spent some time browsing through the various stalls, before I picked up a squid salad, while Gunma went for a tasty-looking fish on a stick. I turned around a few times in paranoia, but Enko was nowhere to be seen, thank the log. I had to say, being back in Konoha was far more enjoyable than I remembered it being, even as a ninja. Maybe it was because there was no fighting going on, but the atmosphere was calming and enjoyable. Of course, the minute I thought that, it was jinxed. "But I can't eat anymore." An infinitely familiar whiny voice filtered through to my ears through the sounds of the crowd. I couldn't help it. I looked around for the source of the voice and found it in one of the stalls. Naruto was sitting at the table with a massive amount of soba noodles placed in front of him, but he wasn't eating, instead he was holding his stomach with both his hands. "But you must! If you don't experience the goodness of soba noodles, how else can I convince you that they are better than ramen? Also, you are my 100th visitor today, that means you get the 2 free extra special big bowls," the owner of the stand exclaimed. He was staring at Naruto with an odd gleam in his eyes that I didn't like the look of. "I don't think I like it. My stomach hurts. I can't eat anymore." Naruto whined piteously as he held his stomach. "But I've worked hard to make it for you. Surely you don't want me to throw the results of my hard work down the garbage bin. Please make this humble chef happy by at least finishing what he puts out in front of you." I had moved a little closer by this point. I didn't remember this sort of thing happening, but then again I didn't recall much of my childhood other than my pranks. Gunma wasn't paying attention, but he had followed me. This allowed me to take a closer look at the dish this chef had prepared. By the look of it, it seemed to be a noodle dish with tofu in it. Alarm bells started ringing in my head for some reason, and I stopped right in front of the stall. "Ugh." Naruto groaned piteously, but he reached for his chopsticks. As soon as he picked up a piece of tofu, the pieces snapped into place. The dish was called kitsune soba. I let loose the full force of my considerable killing intent smack in the middle of Konoha. The nearby civilians completely froze while the shinobi immediately honed on me, including Genman next to me. I jumped forward and smacked the chopsticks out of Naruto's hands and grabbed him, putting my body in between him and the motherfucker who had tried to poison him. Genma was at my side in a flash. "Take him to the hospital, he's been poisoned," I ordered, not letting up on my killing intent. He took one look at the groaning Naruto and, upon recognizing him, immediately put together what had happened. Without saying a word, he put his arm across the child's shoulders and disappeared in a shunshin. I was stalking towards the little shit with a kunai in my hand, when had it appeared there, who had tried to fucking murder a child in the middle of Konoha when an incoming shunshin forced me to stop lest I run into it. I didn't as much as use my peripherals to try and recognize the person who had stopped me. I was hyper-focused on the chef. A female voice spoke up, "What is going on here?" I vaguely realized that the voice belonged to Anko, but I was too incensed to care. This little shit just tried to poison a child. I'm going to make sure he never does anything of the sort again. "Where is this child?" She immediately shot back. "Shirani Genma has taken him to the hospital. The dish is on the table. You're not going to stop me from killing this motherfucker anymore." I took a step forward, but Anko pulled out a kunai of her own and placed it in a place where men don't like to be threatened. Despite that, I considered going ahead anyway. I was seeing red, and I wasn't in the mood to be reasonable. Anko directed her comments to the chef. "Is this true? Did you try to poison a child?" A murderously hateful expression twisted his face. "That's not a child. That's a demon in disguise. He should be killed bfurk." The reason for him stopping talking was the sudden appearance of a kunai in the middle of his throat. Blood flew out in an arc and then continued gushing in a never-ending stream as he foolishly pulled out the kunai and tried to stop the bleeding. Anko returned to a standing position after having thrown the kunai that was previously near my nether regions. "You broke the Sandaime Hokage's law. The punishment is death." He was still making choking noises as he futilely tried to draw breath. I stepped around Anko and crouched down near his face. I had not let up on the killing intent since I had figured out what was going on. As he finally locked eyes with me, I made sure my words were slow and deliberate. "The only demon here is you, because only demons try to murder a child." A few seconds later, he turned completely purple and stopped trying to draw breath, having drowned in his own blood. As soon as I was sure he was dead, I let up my killing intent. There was an audible sigh of relief from the spectators, quite a few of whom collapsed to the ground, the adrenaline leaving their systems. I seriously considered taking off my mask just to spit at his corpse, but I had a large audience already, and I didn't want to make things worse for myself. When I finally turned around, only Anko was looking at me. The civilians were being evacuated from the vicinity by both on- and off-duty shinobi. One more shinobi came along and put the poison dish in a plastic bag before sealing it in a scroll. I wasn't sure if it was for investigative purposes or for identifying the poison so that it could be cured. Before I could ask him, Anko spoke. "How did you realize that he was trying to kill the boy?" I sneered. He was almost force-feeding Naruto despite the fact that he was complaining about his stomach hurting. I noticed that the dish is one called kitsune soba. Along with his general demeanor, that was enough to realize what was going on. Her pupilless eyes stayed trained on me. No doubt she was verifying the veracity of my statement. Having worked in TNI, she was no doubt more skilled than most at identifying the truth. In any case, I was telling the truth. She seemed to reach the same conclusion and put her hands on her hips. "I will be reporting this to the top brass. Despite the fact that it was I who killed him, you were the one to disturb the peace and make a scene. Excuse me for trying to save a child's life." I sneered. This was ridiculous. She shook her head, not taking her eyes off mine. She said softly, "Your reasons were valid. However, it is a law in this village that a shinobi cannot unleash their killing intent without good reason. Every such incident is investigated thoroughly. Nothing will come of it, there were witnesses, but it is a procedure that is to be followed." I scoffed, but didn't refute her statement. The law was a sensible one, but this was clearly a special circumstance. In any case, I no longer had an excuse to avoid the Hokage Tower tomorrow. "Fine. I'll show up for a slap on the wrist tomorrow. Happy?" She looked at me for a second longer, before suddenly removing her hands from her hips and crossing them under her breasts, pushing them up. A mischievous smile came across her face as her demeanor made a complete 180 degrees. "You owe me a rematch, you know," she said playfully, her eyes glittering. I wasn't in the mood, and I wasn't shy about letting her know it either. "You lost. Accept it and move on." I started walking away. She pouted and called after me, "Fine, be that way. But if I were you, I would watch my back." I just ignored her, still too pissed from the near-murder attempt on my life. I vaguely recalled being in the hospital from food poisoning. I was too young to realize that it was actual poisoning. I made my way to the Hokage monument to sit on my father's head. That was an action that always calmed me down. As I stared out over the village still lit up by the carnival lights, my anger finally burned away. Somehow it felt worse when I saw it happening to someone else, even if that someone was a younger me. While I had been the subject of the stares and the occasional sneaky attempt that got past the ANBU, I never actually held it against the person. Perhaps it was because I was a naive idiot at the time, but I like to think it was because the attempts made me a stronger person. Or maybe I just thought that all adults were dumb as hell for thinking me to be a demon. The moon was waning. Last night had been the full moon. It was only when I thought about what I had been doing last night that I realized my hypocrisy. 24 hours earlier I had been seriously considering killing another 10-year-old boy for crimes which he had not committed. Sheesh. Even my own subconscious was acknowledging that the Sandaime had a point. Perhaps it was a good thing that I was going to face the old man tomorrow. It would provide me an opportunity to apologize to him. I sighed. Time travel was a complicated business, especially when I didn't even know why I had traveled. Well, at least tomorrow I would get to meet the old man Hokage. Then I could put in the request to assist Kiri with the rebellion. It was around the time when they should be looking for allies, if what I remembered was right. We would need all the allies we could muster against the enemy, and the sooner I managed to unite all the villages against Akatsuki the better. I walked back to my apartment building, with vague thoughts in my head about saving Itachi from his fate. Maybe it wasn't up to me to make sure Sasuke stayed on the straight and narrow. If I could find a way to mitigate the fallout from the truth about the Uchiha massacre, it would no longer be my headache. As I got ready for bed, I resolved to talk to the Hokage about it when I saw him tomorrow. After a profuse apology, of course.